You think you're tough enough to survive anything. But the Mongols had a breakfast ritual that would make Navy SEALs quit on day one. What they consumed every morning wasn't just food. It was something so disturbing that it reveals why even their allies feared them more than their enemies. In 1206, a man named Temujin did something that changed the world forever. He united the warring tribes of Mongolia under one banner and took a new name: Genghis Khan. What started as a collection of feuding nomads on the Asian steppes became the largest land empire in human history. We're talking about an empire that stretched from China's eastern coast all the way to Eastern Europe's doorstep. The numbers are staggering. At its peak, the Mongol Empire covered over 9 million square miles. That's roughly 16% of the entire planet's land surface. To put this in perspective, it was 4 times larger than Alexander the Great's empire and twice the size of the Roman Empire at its height. The Mongols didn't just conquer territory, they connected it. Before the Mongols, traveling from Beijing to Baghdad was a death sentence for most people. Different languages, hostile kingdoms, and constantly shifting borders made long-distance travel nearly impossible. But the Mongols changed all that. They created the first truly global trade network, linking east and west in ways that hadn't existed before. A merchant could carry silk from China and sell it in European markets, all under Mongol protection. The military machine behind this expansion was unlike anything the world had seen. Mongol armies moved faster than their enemies thought possible. While European knights were still figuring out how to mount their heavy horses, Mongol cavalry was already circling behind them at full gallop. Each Mongol warrior typically had 3 to 5 horses, switching between them to maintain incredible speed over vast distances. But here's what made them truly terrifying: they fought to win, not to look honorable. European warfare had rules, codes of conduct, and ideas about fair play. The Mongols threw all that out the window. They used psychological warfare, fake retreats, siege engines captured from Chinese engineers, and intelligence networks that would make modern spies jealous. When they showed up at your city walls, surrender was often the smart choice. The transformation wasn't just military, it was social, economic, and cultural. Millions of people who had lived their entire lives in small, isolated communities suddenly found themselves part of something massive. A farmer in Hungary might find Mongol administrators collecting taxes. A craftsman in Persia could receive orders for goods destined for Mongolia. The world got smaller, faster. What's fascinating is how quickly this happened. Within Genghis Khan's lifetime, the Mongols went from tribal raids to controlling territory from Korea to the Caspian Sea. His successors pushed even further. By 1279, Mongol forces had conquered the Song dynasty in China, established the Golden Horde in Russia, and were collecting tribute from kingdoms across Central Asia and the Middle East. The warrior culture that drove this expansion wasn't just about fighting, it was about survival. On the harsh Mongolian steppes, weakness meant death. Winters could kill entire herds. Rival tribes could wipe out families overnight. The Mongols developed a society where military skill, loyalty, and adaptability weren't just valued, they were essential for staying alive. Every Mongol male was expected to be a warrior. There was no separate military class because there couldn't be. When your entire way of life depended on mobility, protection, and resource acquisition, everyone needed to know how to fight. Children learned archery before they learned to read. Actually, most never learned to read at all. This warrior mentality shaped everything about Mongol society. All leadership went to those who could win battles and keep their people alive. Wealth meant horses, weapons, and livestock, things that could move with you or help you take what you needed. Even their legal system reflected this harsh reality. The Yasar, their code of laws, was brutal but effective. It had to be. Then there's the religious aspect that surprises many people. Despite their reputation for destruction, the Mongols were remarkably tolerant of different faiths. They conquered Buddhist kingdoms, Islamic states, and Christian territories, but they rarely forced religious conversion. Why? Practical politics. It's easier to govern people who aren't constantly rebelling over forced faith changes. The empire's communication system was revolutionary. The Yam, their postal relay network, could carry messages across continents faster than anything that existed before the telegraph. Fresh horses every 30 miles meant riders could cover distances that took others weeks in just days. Information moved at speeds that seemed magical to people of that era. But empires built on conquest face inevitable challenges. The very size that made the Mongols powerful also made them difficult to control. Distant provinces developed their own interests. Succession disputes split the empire into competing khanates. The warrior culture that created the empire struggled to adapt to governing settled populations. What began with Genghis Khan's vision of a united Mongolia became something far larger and more complex than anyone could have predicted. Yet understanding this remarkable expansion is only half the story. To really grasp how the Mongols changed the world, you need to understand how they actually lived day to day, starting with life on those windswept steppes where it all began. The Mongol Empire was born from conquest, but before the armies and the glory, there was a completely different way of life. Most Mongols never lived in palaces or permanent cities. They lived on the steppes, endless grasslands that stretched for thousands of miles across Asia. These weren't your typical suburban neighborhoods. The steppes were harsh, open spaces where the wind never stopped howling and the horizon seemed to go on forever. No houses, no fences, no corner stores, just grass, sky, and the constant movement of people following their animals across the land. The Mongols were nomads, which means they never stayed in one place for very long. Their entire existence revolved around moving with their herds of sheep, goats, horses, and cattle. When the grass got eaten down in one area, it was time to pack up and find fresh pastures. This wasn't a vacation, this was survival. Moving meant everything had to be portable. Forget about heavy furniture or fancy decorations. Every single possession had to fit on the back of an animal or in a cart. The Mongols became masters of living light, but that didn't mean living poorly. They just did it differently than anyone else in the world. Their homes were called yurts, and these things were engineering marvels for their time. Round, dome-shaped tents made from felt and held together with horsehair ropes. The beauty of a yurt was that it could be taken apart and put back together in less than an hour. Try doing that with a brick house. But here's where it gets interesting. The Mongols didn't just wander randomly across the steppes like lost tourists. They followed ancient migration patterns that had been passed down through generations. They knew exactly where to go in spring for the best grass, where to spend summer near water sources, and where to hunker down for the brutal winters. The animals weren't just livestock, they were everything. Sheep provided wool for clothing and felt for yurts. Their milk became cheese and other dairy products. Goats were hardy and could survive on almost nothing. Cattle were walking banks, representing wealth and status. Then there were the horses, which deserved their own category entirely. Horses were the Mongols' secret weapon long before they became a military force. These weren't the tall, elegant horses you see in movies. Mongol horses were short, stocky, and tough as nails. They could survive on grass alone and keep going in weather that would kill other breeds. Without these horses, the Mongol way of life would have been impossible. The rhythm of nomadic life followed the seasons like clockwork. Spring meant moving to fresh pastures and watching new animals being born. Summer brought longer days for traveling and the best grazing. Fall was preparation time, fattening up animals and gathering supplies. Winter was about survival, pure and simple. Weather wasn't just an inconvenience on the steppes, it was a matter of life and death. A sudden blizzard could trap families for weeks. Drought could force emergency moves to find water. Extreme cold could kill entire herds overnight. The Mongols learned to read the sky like a book because their lives depended on it. Children grew up knowing that comfort was temporary and change was constant. They learned to sleep on the ground, eat whatever was available, and help with the herds from the time they could walk. This wasn't considered hardship, this was just normal life. The steppes taught harsh lessons, resources were limited, so nothing could be wasted. Cooperation was essential because no family could survive completely alone. Strength mattered, but so did intelligence and adaptability. These weren't abstract concepts, they were daily realities. What's fascinating is how this lifestyle shaped the Mongol character. They became incredibly resilient, practical, and mobile. They weren't attached to places or things the way settled people were. Home wasn't a location, it was wherever the family and animals happened to be at the moment. The nomadic life also created natural warriors. Riding horses all day built incredible stamina and balance. Constantly moving across dangerous terrain developed quick reflexes and decision-making skills. Dealing with wild animals and harsh weather made them fearless. Protecting herds from wolves and raiders gave them combat experience. This mobile lifestyle had another unexpected advantage. It made the Mongols nearly impossible to defeat using traditional military tactics. You can't besiege people who don't live in cities. You can't destroy their crops because they don't farm. You can't cut off their supply lines because they carry everything with them. Yet, life on the steppes wasn't just about survival and hardship. There was also beauty, freedom, and a deep connection to the natural world that settled people rarely experienced. The Mongols knew every star in the sky, every change in the wind, every sign that predicted weather or indicated good grazing ahead. This nomadic foundation would soon transform into something much larger and more complex. The scattered tribes living their traditional lives on the grasslands were about to be forged into a unified force. But the success of that transformation depended entirely on understanding how these family groups and tribal structures actually worked together. When you strip away everything else about Mongol society, what's left standing? Family. Not the modern nuclear family with their weekend barbecues and soccer practice schedules. We're talking about something much deeper, much tougher, and way more complicated. Picture this for a moment. You wake up in a yurt on the steppes, and everyone around you shares the same bloodline going back generations. Your great-great-grandfather's name isn't just written in some dusty family tree, it's literally your clan's identity. Every single person you call family carries that ancestral name like a badge of honor. The Borjigin clan, the Teitude clan, the Merkits. These weren't just surnames, they were your entire world. But here's where it gets interesting. Mongol society wasn't built on individual achievement or personal ambition like we think about today. Everything revolved around loyalty to your blood relatives first, then your extended clan, and finally your tribe. Miss this hierarchy, and you'd find yourself completely lost in their world. Let's break down how this actually worked. Your immediate family lived together in that cramped yurt we talked about earlier. Parents, kids, maybe a grandparent or two if they were lucky enough to survive the harsh steppes. But right next to you, another yurt filled with your cousins, and another with your uncle's family, and another with your second cousins. Sometimes these family clusters stretched for miles across the grassland. Each clan traced their lineage back to a single male ancestor, usually someone who had done something impressive enough to be remembered, or won a great battle, survived an impossible winter, or maybe just lived long enough to have lots of sons. These ancestral fathers became legendary figures whose names got passed down through generations of campfire stories. Then there's the weird part about how clans actually functioned. They weren't just big happy families sitting around sharing meals. Every clan had internal politics that would make modern office drama look like child's play. Older brothers held authority over younger ones. Successful hunters got more respect than struggling herders. All wealthy families within the clan could basically boss around the poorer relatives. But when outsiders threatened the clan, all that internal squabbling disappeared instantly. Blood loyalty trumped everything else, including personal grudges, economic disputes, and even romantic rivalries. Cross one member of a Mongol clan, and you'd suddenly find yourself facing dozens of angry relatives armed with bows and curved sabers. Multiple clans eventually banded together to form tribes, but this wasn't some democratic process with voting and committees. Strong clans absorbed weaker ones through a combination of marriage alliances, military pressure, and sometimes outright conquest. The most powerful clan leader became the tribal Khan, and everyone else fell in line behind him. Here's what made Mongol tribal structure different from other societies. Weak clans didn't get completely wiped out or enslaved when they joined a stronger tribe. They kept their animals, their family structure, and even their ancestral names. They just had to accept the new pecking order and contribute warriors when the Khan demanded it. Khans ruled their tribes with absolute authority, but even they couldn't ignore clan loyalties completely. Smart Khans made sure to reward the most important clan leaders with positions of influence, marriage connections, and shares of any plunder from raids. Stupid Khans who tried to rule through fear alone usually found themselves overthrown by angry clan coalitions. Marriage became the ultimate political tool in this system. Families didn't arrange marriages for love or even compatibility. They used weddings to cement alliances between clans, settle disputes over grazing rights, or gain access to better warriors. Young people rarely had any say in these arrangements, but the survival of entire family groups often depended on making the right connections. Women played crucial roles in maintaining these clan networks, even though men held most of the official leadership positions. Mothers arranged marriages for their children. Wives served as informal ambassadors between different clan groups. Sisters and daughters carried messages and negotiated deals that their fathers and brothers couldn't handle directly. The loyalty system went both ways though. Clan leaders had real responsibilities toward their relatives. They had to share resources during harsh winters, provide protection from enemies, and make sure widows and orphans didn't starve. Selfish leaders who hoarded wealth while their clan members suffered would quickly find their authority challenged by angry relatives. What's fascinating is how this family-based system actually made the Mongols incredibly effective at warfare. When Genghis Khan started building his empire, he didn't have to create loyalty from scratch. He just had to convince existing clan and tribal leaders that following him would benefit their families. Once he did that, those leaders brought their entire extended family networks into his army. But loyalty came with a price that would shape everything from their daily routines to their brutal justice system, which brings us to our next chapter. The Mongol Empire wasn't some free-for-all where everyone rode around doing whatever they wanted. This was a carefully structured society with clear rules about who had power and who didn't. At the very top sat the Great Khan, the supreme ruler whose word was absolute law. Below him stretched layers of nobles, warriors, commoners and slaves in a hierarchy so rigid that stepping out of line could cost you everything. The Khan controlled vast territories and commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. He decided which cities lived or died, which trade routes stayed open, and which clans received favor or punishment. But here's what made Mongol leadership different from European kings. The Khan earned his position through strength, cunning and military success, rather than just being born into it. Well, mostly. Once a dynasty got established, things got more hereditary, but the threat of being overthrown by a stronger rival always loomed. Right beneath the Khan came the nobles, who controlled specific regions and commanded their own armies. These weren't pampered aristocrats sitting in castles eating grapes. Mongol nobles led from the front lines, fought alongside their men, and maintained their status through constant displays of military prowess. They owned massive herds, controlled grazing territories, and collected tribute from conquered peoples. Lose a major battle or show weakness, another ambitious noble would gladly take your place. Then there's the fascinating part about Mongol military organization. Every able-bodied man was automatically a soldier when needed. This wasn't optional military service, in either case this was survival. Boys started training with bows and arrows as soon as they could walk, and by their teens they were expected to ride into battle alongside seasoned warriors. The empire divided its forces into units of 10, 100,000 and 10,000 men called tumans. Each soldier knew exactly where he belonged in this structure and who he answered to. The beauty of this system lay in its brutal efficiency. A Mongol commander could mobilize tens of thousands of troops in days, not months. Compare that to European armies that took forever to assemble and coordinate. Makes sense, right? When your entire male population doubles as your military force, you can respond to threats or opportunities with lightning speed. But what about everyone else? Commoners formed the backbone of Mongol society: herders, craftsmen, traders and farmers in conquered territories. These people enjoyed more freedom than you might expect under such an authoritarian system. As long as they paid their taxes, provided supplies when armies passed through, and didn't rebel, they could pretty much manage their daily lives without interference. The Mongols were surprisingly practical rulers who cared more about results than micromanaging every aspect of civilian life. Herders maintained the massive flocks and herds that fed the empire. Skilled craftsmen produced weapons, tools and luxury goods. Merchants facilitated trade across the Silk Road and other routes. These weren't glamorous positions, but they offered stability and the chance to prosper if you worked hard and stayed loyal. At the bottom of this social pyramid sat the slaves, mostly prisoners captured during conquests. The weird part is that slavery in the Mongol Empire often worked differently than in other societies. Talented slaves could sometimes rise to important positions if they proved their worth. Some became administrators, translators, or even military advisors. Others remained laborers for life, working in mines, construction projects, or as household servants. Let's not forget the role of women in this hierarchy. Mongol women held more power and respect than their counterparts in most medieval societies. Noble women could own property, lead troops, and influence major political decisions. The Khan's wives and mothers often served as trusted advisors, and sometimes ruled territories in their own right. Even common women enjoyed freedoms that would shock Europeans of the same era. The empire maintained this social order through a combination of rewards and punishments that would make your head spin. Loyalty brought wealth, status, and protection. Betrayal brought swift, brutal justice that served as a warning to others. The Mongols understood that fear and opportunity were equally powerful motivators for keeping people in line. This hierarchy wasn't just about power, it was about survival on a massive scale. The steppes were harsh, enemies surrounded the empire on all sides, and managing millions of people across thousands of miles required clear chains of command. Everyone knew their place, their duties, and the consequences of failure. But here's where things get interesting about daily life under this system. Your social position determined everything from what you wore to what you ate to where you could travel. The clothes on your back told everyone exactly where you fit in the grand scheme of things, and stepping outside those boundaries could land you in serious trouble. Your neighbors today judge you by your car, your house, maybe your sneakers. In the Mongol Empire, everything came down to what you wore. Clothing wasn't just about staying warm or looking decent, it was a survival manual written in fabric and fur. Most Mongols wrapped themselves in sheep wool and animal skins because that's what they had. Sheep provided the foundation of their wardrobe, literally. The wool got spun into thick, durable fabric that could handle months of hard riding across frozen steppes. But here's where it gets interesting. Mongols didn't just throw on any old sheepskin and call it a day, they layered strategically. Think medieval tactical gear, but make it nomadic. The base layer was always wool, then came the leather or fur outer garments. During winter they'd pile on multiple layers until they looked like walking bundles of fabric. Smart move when temperatures drop to -40 and the wind wants to kill you. Boots deserved special attention because your feet kept you alive. Mongol boots weren't designed for walking around town or looking fashionable at the market. These were engineering marvels built for spending 12 hours a day in stirrups. The soles were thick enough to protect against sharp rocks and frozen ground, while the tops reached halfway up the shin to prevent snow from getting inside. Leather construction meant they could flex with the rider's movements but still provide solid support when standing in stirrups to shoot arrows. The weird part is how perfectly these boots worked for their lifestyle. Modern cowboy boots actually borrowed heavily from this ancient Mongol design, and for good reason. Nothing beats them for long-distance riding. War helmets tell their own story about Mongol priorities. Iron helmets meant serious business and serious money. Only experienced warriors or wealthy nobles could afford proper iron protection for their heads. Everyone else made do with hardened leather helmets that offered some protection but wouldn't stop a direct sword blow. These helmets featured distinctive shapes that served multiple purposes. The pointed or rounded tops helped deflect incoming strikes, while the wide brims protected the neck and shoulders from arrows falling at angles. Some helmets included chainmail extensions that covered the back of the neck, a vital area during retreat or when turning in the saddle to shoot backward. Then there's the color system that modern people completely miss. Bright colors weren't about looking pretty or expressing personality. They were military rank indicators and social status markers rolled into one visual system. Red fabrics often indicated high-ranking warriors or clan leaders. Yellow showed connections to the Khan's inner circle. Blue marked certain military units or tribal affiliations. But getting these bright colors wasn't simple. Dyes came from specific plants, minerals or insects that had to be traded from distant regions. A bright red deal, the traditional Mongol robe, might represent months of successful raiding or trading just to acquire the proper dye materials. When you saw someone wearing vivid colors, you knew they had resources and connections. Jewelry served as portable wealth storage, which makes perfect sense for nomadic people. You can't exactly haul around a treasure chest while moving camps every few months. Instead, Mongols converted their wealth into wearable assets. Silver armbands, bronze belt buckles and bone ornaments weren't just decorative, they were the medieval equivalent of a savings account. Bone jewelry might sound primitive, but it was actually quite practical. Horse bone, sheep bone, and deer antler could be carved into intricate designs that lasted for decades. More importantly, bone didn't rust, tarnish, or require special maintenance like metal jewelry. For people living rough outdoor lives, bone accessories made perfect sense. Silver and bronze pieces indicated higher social status and greater wealth. These metals had to be mined, refined, and worked by skilled craftsmen, expensive processes that drove up the final cost. A Mongol warrior wearing silver jewelry was essentially wearing his military success and family connections for everyone to see. Women's jewelry often included practical elements like needle cases, small knives, or fire-starting tools disguised as decorative pieces. This dual-purpose approach reflected the practical nature of Mongol culture, where everything had to serve multiple functions. The clothing system created instant recognition across the empire. You could spot a Mongol warrior from a distance by his distinctive silhouette, the layered robes, the characteristic boots, the helmet shape. This visual uniformity helped maintain military coordination and cultural identity across thousands of miles of conquered territory. Climate shaped every clothing choice these people made. Summer meant lighter wool garments and fewer layers. Winter demanded everything they owned piled onto their bodies at once. Spring and fall required constant adjustment as temperatures swung wildly between freezing and comfortable. What they ate determined their energy levels and how much work they could accomplish each day, and their daily diet was unlike anything most modern people would recognize as food. Fresh meat dominated every meal in the Mongol Empire. Not just any meat though. We're talking about mutton from sheep, horse meat when necessary, and whatever animals they could hunt along the way. Vegetables barely existed in their world. Grains only when they could steal them from conquered territories or trade for them. The Mongol diet was almost entirely animal-based, and it had to be. Their nomadic lifestyle didn't allow for farming wheat or growing carrots. Boiled mutton appeared on the menu nearly every single day. They'd throw chunks of sheep into large pots with water and let it cook until tender. Simple preparation, but it kept families fed during long migrations across the steppes. The cooking process also meant they could eat every part of the animal. Nothing went to waste when survival was always hanging by a thread. Bones got cracked open for marrow, organs became delicacies, and even the blood found its way into sausages. But here's where things get interesting for modern taste buds. The Mongols regularly ate horse meat, and they didn't consider it unusual or desperate. Horses were valuable for riding and warfare, sure, but older horses or those injured beyond usefulness became dinner. Raw horse meat was sometimes consumed during military campaigns when lighting fires would reveal their position to enemies. Warriors would place thin slices of raw horse under their saddles, and the constant pressure and body heat from riding would cure the meat by day's end. Then there's airag, their signature drink that would probably send most people running today. This fermented mare's milk packed enough alcohol to get you buzzed, but it was considered essential nutrition rather than just a party beverage. Women would milk the mares multiple times daily, then store the milk in leather bags where natural fermentation would begin. The bags got shaken regularly to keep the fermentation process active. The result, a slightly fizzy, mildly alcoholic drink that could be stored for months without spoiling. Dairy products dominated their liquid intake beyond just airag. Fresh mare's milk, sheep's milk, and goat's milk provided crucial vitamins and calories. They made various types of cheese, though nothing like what you'd find in a modern grocery store. Their cheese was often dried into hard blocks that could survive long journeys without refrigeration. These cheese blocks were so hard that warriors sometimes had to soak them in water or milk before eating. Seasonal availability controlled their menu more than personal preferences ever could. Spring brought fresh milk from animals giving birth, but it also meant the herds were weakest after surviving harsh winters. Summer offered the best hunting opportunities and the healthiest animals producing the richest milk. Fall meant preparing preserved meats and dairy products for winter survival. Winter, that's when families relied on whatever they'd managed to store, and fresh food became scarce. Vegetables appeared in their diet only through conquest or trade. When Mongol armies captured agricultural settlements, they'd temporarily gorge themselves on grains, fruits, and vegetables. But these foods couldn't be preserved easily during nomadic migrations, so plant-based nutrition remained sporadic at best. Wild onions, garlic, and berries were gathered when available, but they never formed a significant part of daily nutrition. The weird part is how this limited diet actually worked for their lifestyle. High-fat, high-protein foods provided the energy needed for long days on horseback and survival in brutal climates. Their bodies adapted to extract maximum nutrition from animal products. Modern nutritionists would probably panic at their complete lack of dietary variety, but Mongol warriors could ride for days on nothing but dried meat and fermented milk. Cooking methods stayed simple by necessity. Boiling was most common since it conserved fuel and water while ensuring safety. Roasting over open fires happened during celebrations or when fuel was abundant. Smoking meat for preservation occurred mainly during autumn when preparing for winter shortages. Frying was nearly non-existent since oil was scarce and valuable. Their eating schedule didn't follow modern meal patterns either. Mongols ate when food was available, and when their nomadic schedule allowed. Sometimes that meant one large meal per day. Other times it meant constant small portions of dried meat and cheese while traveling. Hunger was a regular companion, not an emergency situation. Water sources determined everything about their diet planning. Clean water was essential for cooking meat safely, and for keeping dairy products from spoiling too quickly. Finding reliable water sources during migrations meant the difference between a successful journey and disaster. Dirty water could kill an entire family faster than enemy arrows. Family size directly impacted food security in ways that seem harsh by today's standards. Larger families needed more animals to survive, but they also had more people to manage herds and prepare food. Smaller families were more vulnerable to losing animals to weather or wolves, but they needed fewer resources to survive difficult seasons. But even with all this focus on meat and dairy, the Mongols understood something crucial about their harsh environment. Their diet wasn't chosen for taste or preference. Every food choice was about survival, storage, and the constant demands of nomadic life. And speaking of survival demands, their housing had to be just as practical and portable as their food sources. From freezing steppes to scorching deserts, the Mongols needed shelter that could move faster than their enemies and survive weather that killed armies. Their solution? The yurt. But calling it just a tent would be like calling a Ferrari just a car. These circular masterpieces weren't thrown together randomly. Every single piece had a purpose, and the Mongols could assemble or tear down an entire home in under 30 minutes. Try doing that with your house when raiders are charging over the hill at dawn. The framework started with a wooden lattice that folded like an accordion. Willow wood worked best because it bent without snapping under pressure. Smart engineering, considering these things needed to survive being dragged across continents by ox carts. The lattice walls clicked together with leather ties, creating a perfect circle that could expand or shrink depending on family size and wealth. Then came the roof poles, called uni, which stretched from the lattice walls to a central wooden ring at the top. This crown ring wasn't just decorative, it was the structural heart of the entire dwelling. Everything depended on that circle staying perfectly balanced. One wrong move during setup and the whole thing collapsed faster than a house of cards. The real genius showed in the covering system. Layers of thick felt made from sheep's wool, wrapped around the frame like a protective cocoon. But here's where it gets interesting. The felt wasn't just slapped on carelessly. Mongols arranged it in overlapping sections that shed rain like fish scales and trapped heat like a thermos bottle. Rich families covered their felt with white canvas or even silk, turning their homes into mobile palaces. Poor families made do with plain felt, but even the simplest yurt provided better insulation than most European peasant houses of the time. The thick wool kept interior temperatures comfortable, even when outside winds hit -40 degrees. Inside layout followed strict cultural rules that everyone understood without discussion. The door always faced south to catch maximum sunlight and avoid northern winds. Cross that threshold and you entered a world organized like a clock face where every spot had meaning and purpose. The fire pit sat dead center, directly under the crown ring opening. Smoke rose straight up and out, while the central location spread heat evenly throughout the space. Women controlled the right side of the yurt, managing cooking supplies, children's belongings, and household tools. Men dominated the left side, storing weapons, saddles, and war gear. The back wall, opposite the entrance, was reserved for the most honored guests and family treasures. Religious items, ancestral weapons, and precious trade goods decorated this sacred space. Nobody sat there without permission, and violating this rule could start blood feuds between families. Wealthy Mongol families turned yurt decoration into an art form that would make modern interior designers jealous. Colorful carpets covered the floors, intricate tapestries hung from the walls, and carved wooden furniture displayed family wealth. Some Khan families owned yurts so large they required multiple ox carts to transport all the pieces. But even luxury had limits on the steppes. Everything inside had to serve multiple purposes and pack efficiently for constant movement. Tables folded flat, containers stacked inside each other, and beds doubled as storage chests. Waste meant death when your entire life fit on a few carts. The door itself deserves special mention because it revealed social status instantly. Poor families hung felt flaps or simple wooden planks. Wealthy clans installed elaborate painted doors with metal hinges and decorative carvings. Some doors were so ornate, they became family heirlooms passed down through generations. Mongols developed fascinating techniques for weatherproofing their mobile homes. They stuffed dried grass between felt layers for extra insulation and sealed gaps with a mixture of animal fat and clay. During extreme storms, they anchored yurts with horsehair ropes so strong they could hold against winds that knocked grown men off their feet. Winter modifications turned yurts into survival pods that kept families alive through blizzards that lasted weeks. Extra felt layers banked snow around the base, and continuous fires created warm microclimates where life continued normally while the outside world froze solid. The portability factor changed everything about Mongol society. While European serfs lived and died in the same villages, Mongol families could relocate their entire household following grass, water, or opportunities for conquest. This mobility became their greatest strategic advantage. Children grew up learning yurt assembly like other kids learned to tie shoes. By age 10, most could identify every pole, rope and felt section by touch alone. This wasn't just practical knowledge, it was survival insurance for a culture that never stayed anywhere long. Even the simplest yurt represented sophisticated engineering that European architects wouldn't match for centuries. The mathematics of the crown ring, the physics of the roof poles, and the chemistry of felt making combined technologies that took generations to perfect. After eating their meat-heavy diet around the fire, Mongol families needed more than just shelter. They needed a justice system that kept their expanding empire from falling apart. Living in the Mongol Empire meant dancing with death every single day, and Mother Nature was often the cruelest dance partner of all. The steppes weren't some peaceful grassland paradise where horses galloped majestically into sunsets. They were a brutal testing ground where families could lose everything in a matter of hours. Winter hit the hardest. We're talking about temperatures that could drop to -40 degrees Celsius. That's cold enough to freeze your saliva before it hits the ground. Livestock would literally freeze to death while standing up, creating eerie ice sculptures across the landscape. When your sheep died, you didn't just lose dinner, you lost your clothing, your shelter materials, and your entire economic foundation. Families who went to sleep wealthy could wake up to find their herds turned into frozen corpses, leaving them with nothing but debt and starvation. The Mongols had a specific term for these catastrophic winters: dews. Different types of dews could destroy communities in unique ways. A white dews meant heavy snow that buried the grass so deep that animals couldn't dig through to eat. They'd starve while standing on top of their food. A black dews was even worse. It meant no snow fell at all, leaving animals without water while bitter winds stripped away their body heat. But wait, it gets more creative in its cruelty. An ice dews occurred when brief warm spells melted snow, only for temperatures to plummet again and create a solid sheet of ice over everything. Horses would slip and break their legs. Sheep couldn't break through the ice to reach grass underneath. People couldn't even collect snow for drinking water because everything was locked under a glassy prison. Then there's drought. The silent killer that crept up slowly before devastating entire regions. Grass would turn brown and brittle, then disappear entirely. Rivers that had flowed for generations would become cracked mud. Wells that had never failed would run dry. Animals would walk for days searching for water, growing weaker with each step until they collapsed and died along ancient migration routes. Strong winds weren't just annoying, they were potentially lethal. Sudden windstorms could tear apart yurts that had been standing for months, scattering families across the steppes in the middle of blizzards. People would lose each other in the chaos, and by the time the wind died down, some family members were already frozen to death just yards away from safety. Disease outbreaks among animals created their own special nightmare. When illness swept through herds, it moved fast and showed no mercy. Healthy horses would be dead within days. Entire flocks of sheep would succumb to mysterious illnesses that spread faster than wildfire. The Mongols understood that animal diseases could jump to humans, but they had no way to prevent or treat these epidemics. What made these climate disasters even more terrifying was their unpredictability. Experienced herders who had survived decades on the steppes could read weather signs better than anyone, but nature still threw curveballs that caught everyone off guard. A mild autumn could suddenly give way to the harshest winter in memory. A promising spring could turn into the driest summer anyone had ever seen. Communities developed survival strategies that seem almost supernatural today. They'd scatter their herds across multiple locations so that if disaster struck one area, some animals might survive elsewhere. Families would form networks where they could call in favors during emergencies. Your sheep die in a blizzard, but your cousin 3 valleys over still has enough animals to help you survive until spring. The psychological toll was enormous. Living under constant threat of natural disaster created a mindset where today's prosperity meant nothing if tomorrow brought catastrophe. This uncertainty shaped everything about Mongol culture: their mobility, their social networks, their willingness to take risks in warfare. When your entire way of life could be wiped out by a single bad winter, raiding your neighbor's resources didn't seem like aggression, it felt like survival. Recovery from climate disasters could take years or even decades. A family that lost their herds might spend generations working as servants for other families, slowly rebuilding their livestock one animal at a time. Some never recovered at all, disappearing from the historical record as completely as if they had never existed. The weird part is how these brutal climate challenges actually strengthened Mongol military capabilities. People who could survive dude's winters and drought summers were automatically tougher than armies from more comfortable climates. Soldiers who had watched their families nearly starve during harsh seasons fought with a desperation that civilized armies couldn't match. These climate survival skills weren't just useful for staying alive on the steppes, they became crucial advantages when the Mongols started expanding their empire beyond the grasslands. But learning to survive nature's worst was only the beginning of a Mongol's education. From the moment they could walk, children faced their own unique set of challenges that would determine whether they lived to see adulthood. Learning to survive in the Mongol Empire started before you could even walk properly. While today's kids worry about homework and video games, Mongol children faced a completely different reality. Their education wasn't about sitting in classrooms, it was about staying alive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Boys got thrown onto horses practically as babies. By age 5, most were riding like they'd been born in the saddle, and honestly, they kind of were. Mongol mothers would strap their toddlers to gentle mares and let the animals do the walking while the kids learned balance, fall off, get back on. No participation trophies here. The training wasn't gentle either. These weren't pony rides at a county fair. Boys learned to control massive war horses that could crush a grown man without blinking. They practiced shooting arrows while galloping at full speed, turning in the saddle to fire backward, and guiding their mounts with just their knees. Makes sense when you realize their lives would depend on these skills before they hit puberty. Girls faced equally demanding expectations, just in different areas. While their brothers mastered horsemanship, girls learned the intricate art of managing everything else. Milking animals might sound simple, but try extracting milk from an angry goat in a freezing windstorm. These girls became experts at reading animal behavior, knowing exactly when a mare was ready for milking or when sheep needed immediate shelter. Then there's the sewing and crafting skills that kept families alive. Mongol girls didn't just learn pretty embroidery patterns. They mastered the complex techniques needed to create weatherproof clothing from animal hides. A poorly sewn boot could mean frostbite. A weak seam in winter clothing could literally kill someone. No pressure, right? But here's what gets really interesting about Mongol childhood education. Formal schools, almost non-existent. These kids learned everything from watching, copying, and making mistakes in real situations. A Mongol child's classroom was the endless steppe, and their teachers were parents who'd survived decades of brutal conditions. Most children couldn't read or write a single word. Why would they need to? Their survival depended on reading weather patterns, animal tracks, and the subtle signs that indicated danger approaching. A Mongol child could spot a wolf pack from miles away, but couldn't spell wolf if their life depended on it. The weird part is how play and deadly serious training blended together seamlessly. Wrestling matches between kids weren't just fun. They built the strength and combat instincts needed for warfare. Archery competitions started as games but developed into the precise shooting skills that made Mongol armies unstoppable. Young children would compete to see who could stay on a bucking horse longest. Winners got extra portions of meat at dinner. Losers, well, they kept practicing until they stopped falling off. The stakes made every game feel like life or death preparation, because eventually it would be. Let's not forget the mental toughness these kids developed. Modern parents worry about their children getting hurt on playground equipment. Mongol parents expected their kids to handle bitter cold, sudden storms, and the constant possibility of enemy raids. Children learned to sleep through howling winds and wake instantly at the first sign of trouble. Family dynamics played a huge role in this education system. Older siblings taught younger ones, creating chains of knowledge that passed down through generations. A 10-year-old might be responsible for teaching a 5-year-old how to identify edible plants or dangerous animals. Everyone had responsibilities, and everyone's survival depended on everyone else doing their jobs correctly. The social aspects were just as crucial as the practical skills. Mongol children learned the complex hierarchy of clan relationships, understanding exactly where they fit in the social structure and who they owed loyalty to. Disrespect the wrong person's child, and your entire family could face serious consequences. What really stands out is how quickly childhood ended in this culture. By their early teens, boys were expected to participate in raids and warfare. Girls might be married and managing their own households before turning 15. The transition from child to adult happened fast because the empire needed capable people, not extended adolescents. The physical demands were relentless too. These kids developed coal-used hands, weather-beaten skin, and muscles that could handle hours of riding or heavy labor. They ate the same challenging diet as adults and faced the same risks from harsh weather and dangerous animals. But perhaps the most important lesson Mongol children learned was adaptability. The nomadic lifestyle meant constant change, new challenges, and unexpected dangers. Kids who couldn't adjust quickly didn't make it to adulthood. This brutal education system produced some of the most effective soldiers and survivors in human history. However, the military training that shaped these tough kids deserves its own closer examination. Boys didn't get participation trophies in Mongol society. By age 5, if you couldn't stay on a horse, you were probably going to die young. The steppes didn't care about your feelings or modern safety standards. Every Mongol child knew that warrior training wasn't optional, it was survival. The moment a boy could walk steadily, his father would lift him onto a pony. Not gently either. These weren't riding lessons with helmets and safety gear. The kid either learned to grip with his legs or hit the ground hard. Most chose to stay on. Falling off meant bruises, but failing to become a warrior meant something much worse for the entire family. Archery practice started around age 7. Mongol boys didn't use toy bows or foam arrows. They got scaled-down versions of real weapons that could actually hurt someone. The targets, sometimes just marks carved into trees. Other times, small animals unlucky enough to wander into range. Missing wasn't just embarrassing, it meant less food for dinner. Then there's the weird part about how they measured progress. Western kids might get gold stars or certificates. Mongol boys got thrown into increasingly dangerous situations to test their skills. Can you hit a target while your horse is galloping? Great. Now try it while someone's shooting arrows back at you. Still alive? Congratulations, you're ready for the next level. Wrestling became serious business by age 10. These weren't friendly matches with referees and rules. Boys fought until someone gave up or couldn't continue. The strongest kids earned respect and better positions in mock battles. The weaker ones, well, they learned to get tougher fast or found themselves assigned to less prestigious roles like herding sheep instead of raiding enemies. Training camps looked nothing like modern boot camps. No barracks, no uniforms, no scheduled meal times. Young warriors lived outdoors for weeks, learning to survive on whatever they could hunt or find. They slept on the ground in all weather. Rain, snow, blazing heat, deal with it, or go home. Except going home meant admitting you weren't cut out for warrior life. Group tactics started early because individual heroes usually ended up dead. Boys learned to move as units, coordinate attacks, and follow orders without question. They practiced mock raids on their own camps, with some kids playing defenders and others acting as attackers. The defending team that got wiped out faced real punishment, extra chores, less food, or public embarrassment. Speed mattered more than strength in many exercises. Mongol armies won battles through mobility, not brute force. Young trainees practiced quick strikes, fast retreats, and rapid regrouping. They learned to shoot arrows accurately while retreating at full gallop. This wasn't easy. Try threading a needle while riding a roller coaster and you'll get the idea. Veteran warriors didn't coddle the trainees. These battle-scarred men had survived decades of actual combat. They knew that gentle instruction would get their students killed later, so they used harsh methods that seem brutal by today's standards. A boy who flinched during sword practice might get a real cut to remind him that flinching in battle meant death. Fear wasn't something to overcome, it was something to use. Trainers taught boys to channel their terror into focused aggression. Scared of pain? Good, that fear would make you faster and more careful. Worried about dying? Excellent. That worry would keep you alert during real fights. The goal wasn't fearless warriors, but fighters who could function effectively despite being terrified. Endurance training pushed kids to their absolute limits. They rode for days with minimal rest, marched through terrible weather, and fought practice battles while exhausted and hungry. The logic was simple: real campaigns wouldn't pause because you were tired or uncomfortable. Better to learn your limits during training than discover them when enemy arrows were flying. Competition drove everything. Boys competed for weapons, horses, food rations, and sleeping spots. The winners got better equipment and more respect. The losers learned to try harder or accept permanent second-class status. This created a warrior culture where everyone constantly pushed themselves to outperform their peers. Weapons maintenance became as important as fighting skills. A broken bowstring or dull sword could mean death in battle. Boys learned to repair their own equipment, make arrows, and keep their gear in perfect condition. They discovered that warrior life involved just as much preparation and maintenance as actual fighting. mental toughness mattered as much as physical strength. Trainers used psychological pressure to weed out kids who might break under stress. They created situations designed to cause panic, confusion, or despair. The ones who stayed calm and focused earned advancement. The ones who cracked got assigned to less critical roles. By age 15, most boys had transformed into competent fighters ready for real combat. They could ride all day, shoot accurately under pressure, and follow complex battle plans. More importantly, they'd developed the ruthless mindset necessary for conquest and survival in a world where weakness invited destruction. But warrior training was just the beginning. The real test came when these young fighters joined actual military campaigns, where the stakes were life, death, and the expansion of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Back on the steppes, young warriors had spent years perfecting their skills with bows and horses. But individual talent meant nothing without organization. The Mongol military machine wasn't just about brave fighters, it was about turning chaos into precision. Every movement, every attack, every retreat followed a system that made European knights look like confused amateurs stumbling around in heavy armor. Speed defined everything. Mongol armies could cover distances that seemed impossible to their enemies. While other armies trudged along at maybe 20 miles per day, Mongol forces routinely marched 60 to 100 miles in a single day. Each warrior rode multiple horses, switching between them to keep the animals fresh. When one horse got tired, the rider simply jumped onto another. No stopping, no resting, no mercy for those who couldn't keep up. The decimal system organized their forces with mathematical precision. Every unit of 10 reported to a unit of 100. Every 100 reported to 1,000. Every 1,000 answered to 10,000. This wasn't accidental. It created perfect command structure, where orders flowed down and information flowed up without confusion. A commander could deploy 40,000 troops with the same ease most people organize a dinner party. Then there's the psychological warfare aspect that really set them apart. Mongol armies used terror as deliberately as they used arrows. Cities that surrendered immediately got decent treatment. Cities that resisted faced complete destruction, with survivors left alive specifically to spread horror stories to the next target. Word traveled fast about what happened to those who fought back. Many battles ended before they began because enemies simply fled rather than face the Mongols. Communication systems during battle reached levels of sophistication that European armies wouldn't match for centuries. Signal flags, war drums and horn calls allowed commanders to coordinate complex maneuvers across vast distances. Different drum patterns meant different tactical orders. Flag positions indicated which units should advance or retreat. Warriors learned these signals until responding became pure instinct. But the weird part is how they handled logistics. The boring stuff that actually wins wars. Most armies struggled to feed themselves during long campaigns. Mongols solved this by traveling light and living off what they carried. Each warrior brought dried meat, fermented mare's milk, and emergency rations that could last weeks. They could survive entirely on what their horses provided. Milk, cheese, and when desperate, blood drawn from living animals without killing them. Mongol cavalry tactics revolutionized warfare through pure innovation. They perfected the feigned retreat, where warriors appeared to flee in panic, drawing enemies into pursuing them across open ground. Once the enemy spread out and lost formation chasing what they thought were cowards, hidden Mongol units would attack from the sides and rear. European knights fell for this trick repeatedly, their heavy armor becoming death traps when surrounded by swift horse archers. Intelligence gathering gave Mongols advantages their enemies never suspected. Spies and scouts mapped enemy territories months before armies arrived. They learned about local politics, identified potential allies among conquered populations, and discovered the best routes for rapid movement. Merchant networks provided cover for intelligence operations, with traders reporting back on city defenses, garrison sizes, and leadership weaknesses. Loyalty to the Khan wasn't just encouraged, it was the foundation of military discipline. Warriors swore personal oaths that bound them beyond death. Breaking these oaths meant execution, not just for the individual but sometimes for their entire family. This created units where desertion became literally unthinkable. Soldiers fought harder, knowing their brothers in arms would never abandon them. Siege warfare showed how Mongols adapted and learned from conquered peoples. Initially, they struggled against fortified cities because steppe warriors knew nothing about stone walls and defensive engineering. War Rather than admit defeat, they captured Chinese engineers, Muslim architects and European specialists, forcing them to build siege engines and teach assault techniques. Within decades, no wall could stop them. The promotion system rewarded merit over birth, creating incentives for exceptional performance. Common herders could rise to command thousands if they showed tactical brilliance and absolute loyalty. Noble sons who proved incompetent got demoted or executed. This meritocracy motivated every warrior to excel because advancement was always possible for those who earned it. Weather became another weapon in their arsenal. Mongol forces timed campaigns to take advantage of seasonal conditions that gave them benefits over enemies. Winter attacks caught agricultural societies unprepared, when stored food ran low and civilian populations couldn't flee easily. Spring campaigns coincided with when horses were strongest after good grazing. Training never stopped, even during peacetime. Mock battles, hunting expeditions and competitive exercises kept skills sharp between wars. Veterans taught younger warriors advanced techniques, ensuring knowledge passed down through generations. Every gathering became an opportunity to practice formations and test new tactics. The decimal organization created accountability that eliminated weak links. If one man in a unit of 10 fled from battle, his 9 companions faced punishment, unless they killed the deserter themselves. This system made every warrior responsible for his comrade's performance, creating peer pressure that maintained discipline better than any outside authority could. Of course, having the world's most efficient killing machine was only useful if you had clear rules about when and how to use it. But that's where things get really dark. Living under Mongol rule meant following the Yossa, their brutal legal code that made modern prison systems look like summer camp. Genghis Khan didn't mess around when it came to keeping order. One wrong move could cost you everything, literally. The Yossa wasn't just a list of suggestions, it was the supreme law that governed every aspect of Mongol society, from how you treated your horse to what you said about your neighbors. Breaking these laws didn't result in a fine or community service. The punishments were swift, severe, and often permanent. Theft topped the list of serious crimes, and the Mongols had zero tolerance for it. Steal a sheep? Death. Take someone's horse? Death. Pocket a few coins from a merchant? You guessed it. Death. But here's where it gets really harsh. Sometimes they'd let you live, but you'd lose a hand or foot instead. Walking around missing body parts served as a permanent warning to everyone else about what happens when you take what isn't yours. Military discipline was even stricter than civilian law. Disobeying a direct order from your commander meant immediate execution. No trial, no explanation, no second chances. Desert your unit during battle. They'd hunt you down and make an example of you in front of the entire army. Cowardice in combat wasn't just shameful, it was a death sentence that extended to your family members too. Then there's the surveillance aspect that would make any dictator jealous. Every Mongol was expected to watch their neighbors and report suspicious behavior. Fail to report a crime you witnessed, you'd face the same punishment as the actual criminal. This created a society where everyone spied on everyone else, making rebellion almost impossible to organize. Religious tolerance existed, but only within strict boundaries. You could worship whatever god you wanted, but disrespecting the Great Khan or Mongol traditions would get you killed instantly. Say something negative about Genghis Khan's ancestors. Fatal mistake. Refuse to participate in important ceremonies. Goodbye. Adultery carried brutal consequences, especially for women. While men might escape with severe beatings, women caught cheating faced death by crushing or drowning. The Mongols believed unfaithful wives threatened the entire social structure, so they eliminated the problem permanently. What made the Yossa particularly terrifying was its unpredictability. Laws could be interpreted differently depending on the mood of local officials. A minor offense might result in a warning one day and execution the next. Justice depended entirely on who you were, who you knew, and whether the judge had eaten a good breakfast. Lying to officials was considered one of the worst possible crimes. The Mongols valued brutal honesty over polite deception. They'd rather hear an uncomfortable truth than a pleasant lie. Get caught in even a small falsehood, and you'd face severe punishment. This created a culture where people spoke directly, sometimes harshly, but rarely dishonestly. Debt collection worked differently too. Can't pay what you owe. The creditor could legally enslave you and your family until the debt was settled. Children born during this slavery remained property of the creditor. Some families spent generations working off relatively small debts because interest kept accumulating. The weird part is how the Yossa protected certain groups while destroying others. Merchants, doctors and religious leaders received special protections under Mongol law. Attack a trader, and you'd face execution. But common farmers or craftsmen had far fewer legal protections and faced harsher punishments for identical crimes. Drunkenness presented an interesting contradiction. While the Mongols loved their fermented mare's milk and drank heavily during celebrations, getting drunk and causing problems could result in severe beatings. They distinguished between ceremonial drinking and problematic drinking, though the line wasn't always clear. Environmental crimes carried serious penalties too: urinate in running water, severe punishment; waste food during lean times, brutal beating. The harsh steppe environment meant survival depended on respecting natural resources, and the law reflected this reality. Legal appeals were virtually non-existent. Once a judge made a decision, that was final. No higher court would review your case, no lawyer would argue your innocence, and no technicalities would save you. Speed mattered more than accuracy in Mongol justice. Collective punishment was another terrifying aspect of the Usa. If one family member committed a serious crime, the entire family could face consequences. This encouraged families to police themselves strictly and prevented individuals from acting recklessly. The most chilling part about Mongol justice was its efficiency. Crimes were investigated quickly, judgments rendered immediately, and punishments carried out on the spot. No lengthy trials, no years of appeals, no overcrowded prisons, just swift, brutal consequences that everyone could witness. But this harsh system wasn't just about cruelty, it served a purpose. Managing a massive empire spanning continents required absolute obedience and social stability. Fear kept millions of diverse people in line when military force alone couldn't reach everywhere. The reputation of Mongol justice often prevented crimes before they happened. Living under this system meant constantly calculating risks and watching your every move. Even thinking rebellious thoughts felt dangerous when your neighbor might report you for a reward. But somehow this brutal order enabled something remarkable: the largest trade network in medieval history, where merchants could travel thousands of miles safely. When the Mongols showed up at your city gates, you had two choices: surrender immediately, and maybe keep breathing, or resist and watch everything you'd ever known turn to ash. There wasn't a third option. The Mongols didn't negotiate, didn't compromise, and definitely didn't give you time to think it over. Cities that opened their gates got to keep most of their people alive. Smart move, considering what happened to everyone else. The Mongols would march in, set up their rules, and life would continue under new management. Sure, you'd pay heavy taxes and follow their laws, but your family would still have heads attached to their shoulders. Makes sense, right? But here's where it gets interesting. The moment a city decided to fight back, the Mongols turned into a different beast entirely. They didn't just defeat you, they made an example that would echo across continents for centuries. Entire populations vanished. Buildings got torn down stone by stone, even the cats and dogs didn't survive the cleanup. Beijing learned this lesson the hard way in 1215. The city held out for months, thinking their massive walls would protect them. Wrong calculation. When Genghis Khan's forces finally broke through, they spent weeks systematically destroying everything. Palaces, temples, markets, homes all reduced to rubble. The smoke could be seen from 50 miles away. Then there's the speed factor that made resistance seem pointless. Mongol armies moved so fast that neighboring cities barely had time to prepare defenses. Or one day you'd hear about a battle happening 300 miles away, and the next week those same warriors would be camped outside your walls. How do you plan for that? Let's not forget their intelligence network. Before the main army even arrived, Mongol spies had already mapped out your defenses, counted your soldiers, and identified which local leaders might switch sides. They knew exactly how much food you had stored, and which gates were weakest. Your secrets weren't secret anymore. Once a city surrendered, the real work began. Mongol administrators moved in with military precision. They conducted detailed censuses, counting every person, every animal, every building. Tax collectors appeared with their record books. Local craftsmen found themselves relocated to wherever the empire needed their skills most. The garrison system kept everything under control. Mongol soldiers stationed permanently in conquered cities made sure nobody got any bright ideas about rebellion. These weren't temporary occupying forces. They built barracks, married local women, and settled in for the long haul. Their children would grow up speaking both languages and keeping both cultures in check. But here's the weird part. Many regions actually got to keep their old rulers, as long as those leaders proved their loyalty to the Khan. Local princes and governors could maintain their positions, collect taxes and run daily affairs. The catch: one hint of betrayal meant their entire bloodline would disappear overnight. Some cities discovered that Mongol rule brought unexpected benefits. Trade routes that had been disrupted by constant warfare suddenly became safe again. Merchants could travel from China to Europe without worrying about bandits or local conflicts. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, created stability that many regions hadn't seen in generations. Administrative efficiency reached levels that impressed even the conquered peoples. Messages traveled faster than ever before. Legal disputes got resolved quickly under Mongol law. Infrastructure projects repaired damage from the initial conquests. Cities that had been burned during resistance campaigns found themselves rebuilt better than before. The Mongols also proved surprisingly practical about local customs. They didn't try to replace every tradition or force their nomadic lifestyle on settled populations. Urban dwellers could keep their houses, their markets, their festivals. As long as taxes got paid and orders got followed, daily life could continue much as it always had. Regional governors answered directly to the Great Khan, but they understood their territories better than distant administrators could. This balance between central control and local knowledge helped the empire manage vastly different cultures and climates. What worked in the steppes of Mongolia might not work in the rice paddies of China. Military garrisons served multiple purposes beyond just keeping order. They protected trade routes from bandits, helped with large construction projects, and provided rapid response to natural disasters. When floods or famines struck, Mongol forces could mobilize resources quickly across their vast network. The empire's response to rebellion never varied: swift, brutal, and complete. Word of these punishments spread faster than the armies themselves, creating a psychological weapon that often prevented conflicts before they started. Why fight when you knew the outcome would be total destruction? This system of conquest and control created the foundation for everything else the Mongols accomplished. But maintaining an empire this massive required more than just military might and administrative efficiency. The Mongols had to navigate something equally complex: the diverse religious beliefs of their conquered peoples, and their surprisingly tolerant approach would reshape spiritual life across half the world. Unlike most empires that forced everyone to worship the same god, the Mongols did something completely different. They let people keep their religions, all of them. Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, shamanism, didn't matter. This wasn't because they were naturally peaceful about religion. The Mongols were ruthless about almost everything else, remember. Their approach was purely practical. Why start unnecessary rebellions over gods when you could focus on collecting taxes and building armies? Smart thinking, actually. Forcing millions of people to abandon their beliefs would create endless uprisings. The Mongols had better things to do than fight religious wars in every conquered city. But here's where it gets interesting. The Mongols didn't just ignore religion, they actively protected it. Religious leaders received special legal protections under Mongol law. Priests, monks, imams, and shamans couldn't be harmed without serious consequences. Touch a holy man and you'd face the Khan's justice. That usually meant death. This protection wasn't free though. Religious institutions often paid taxes to the Mongol authorities. Temples and monasteries became revenue sources for the empire. Makes sense, right? These places accumulated wealth from donations and land ownership. The Mongols saw opportunity where others saw only spiritual matters. Then there's the fascinating part about holidays. Major religious celebrations continued across the empire without interference. Christians celebrated Easter, Muslims observed Ramadan, Buddhists honored their festivals. The Mongols even participated sometimes, especially if food and drinking were involved. They loved a good feast regardless of which god was being honored. Well, the Mongols had their own spiritual practices too. Traditional shamanism remained strong among the Mongol people themselves. They believed shamans could communicate with spirits and predict the future. Before major battles, Mongol generals often consulted shamans for guidance. Ancient traditions mixed with conquered territories' religions created a unique spiritual landscape. Religious tolerance also served diplomatic purposes. When Mongol ambassadors visited foreign courts, they could discuss local religions knowledgeably. This impressed potential allies and made negotiations smoother. Some Mongol leaders even converted to local religions when it benefited their political goals. Flexibility over rigid doctrine, and the weird part is how this policy attracted scholars and religious teachers from everywhere. The Mongol Empire became a meeting place for different faiths. Buddhist monks traveled from Tibet to Persia. Christian missionaries journeyed from Europe to China. Islamic scholars moved freely between cities. Ideas spread faster than ever before in human history. Let's not forget that some regions had multiple religions coexisting in the same communities. Mongol cities might have a Buddhist temple, Christian church, and Islamic mosque within walking distance. People could choose their own spiritual path without fear of persecution from the government. Revolutionary thinking for the 13th century. Religious debates happened regularly in Mongol courts. Khans enjoyed listening to scholars argue about different beliefs. These weren't just intellectual exercises, they were entertainment. Imagine watching a Buddhist monk debate a Christian priest while a Mongol Khan munched on roasted mutton and decided who made better arguments. But why did this tolerance work so well? The Mongols understood that religious identity ran deeper than political loyalty. People would die for their gods before abandoning them. Fighting those battles wasted resources and created martyrs. Better to let people pray however they wanted. While you focused on collecting tribute and expanding territory, the policy created unexpected benefits too. Religious networks became information channels for the Mongol administration. Monks and priests traveled constantly between communities, carrying news along with their spiritual duties. The Mongols gained intelligence about distant regions through these religious connections. Some religious leaders became powerful political advisors. Mongol Khans consulted with trusted spiritual guides when making important decisions. These advisors came from different faiths, giving rulers multiple perspectives on complex problems. Religious wisdom mixed with political strategy produced effective governance in many cases. However, religious tolerance had limits. If any religious group threatened Mongol authority or encouraged rebellion, protection disappeared quickly. The Mongols wouldn't tolerate political challenges disguised as religious movements. Spiritual freedom existed within clear boundaries of political obedience. Religious art and architecture flourished under Mongol rule too. New styles developed as different traditions influenced each other. Islamic geometric patterns appeared in Buddhist temples. Christian symbols showed up in Central Asian artwork. Cultural exchange accelerated through religious tolerance. This approach influenced how future empires handled religious diversity. The Mongol example showed that tolerance could strengthen rather than weaken imperial control. Managing beliefs through accommodation rather than suppression became a recognized strategy for ruling diverse populations. The religious policies reveal something important about Mongol thinking. They valued results over ideology. Whatever worked to maintain their empire was acceptable. This pragmatic approach extended beyond religion into trade, administration, and military tactics. Their flexibility would prove crucial when managing the massive trade networks that connected their empire, where merchants from different cultures and faiths needed protection and cooperation to keep goods flowing across continents. The Mongol Empire wasn't just about conquest and bloodshed. While warriors rode across continents, something equally revolutionary was happening behind the scenes. Trade, commerce, money changing hands across distances that would make modern shipping companies jealous. Before the Mongols took over, trading between distant lands was like playing Russian roulette with your life savings. Bandits lurked on every mountain pass. Local warlords demanded bribes at every border. A merchant might start with a caravan full of silk in China and arrive in Persia with nothing but the clothes on his back. The Mongols flipped this chaos upside down. Suddenly a trader could travel from Beijing to Baghdad without getting robbed, kidnapped or murdered. Well, mostly, the empire created what historians now call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. This wasn't peace because everyone held hands and sang songs. This was peace because anyone who messed with traders got their entire city burned to the ground. Genghis Khan and his successors understood something brilliant about economics. Dead merchants don't pay taxes, robbed caravans don't generate revenue. Happy traders, on the other hand, make everyone rich, including the Khans who collected taxes from every transaction. The famous Silk Road wasn't actually one road, it was a network of routes stretching over 4,000 miles. Chinese silk moved west while Persian carpets traveled east. Indian spices met European silver, somewhere in the middle. Mongol protection made it all possible. Merchants paid taxes to the empire, but in return they got something priceless: safety. Let's not forget the sheer variety of goods crossing these routes. Silk was obvious, lightweight, valuable, and in huge demand everywhere. But traders also moved precious stones, furs, ceramics, and even exotic animals. Imagine explaining to your wife why you brought home a leopard from Central Asia instead of the jewelry she wanted. The Mongols created standardized weights and measures across their territories. No more arguing about whether a pound in one city equaled a pound in another. They also established a uniform currency system in many regions. This might sound boring, but it was revolutionary. Try doing business today if every state used different money and measuring systems. Then there's the matter of credit and banking. Mongol merchants developed sophisticated financial instruments that let traders conduct business without carrying tons of actual coins. Paper money and letters of credit became common. A merchant could deposit silver in Karakorum and withdraw the equivalent value in gold, thousands of miles away in Samarkand. The empire's postal system, the yam, wasn't just for government messages. Merchants used it to send business correspondence across vast distances. Orders, contracts, and market information traveled at unprecedented speeds. A trader in one city could learn about price changes in distant markets weeks before his competitors. But the weird part is how the Mongols balanced control with freedom. They taxed trade heavily, sometimes taking 10% or more of a caravan's value. Yet merchants gladly paid because Mongol protection was worth every coin. The alternative was losing everything to bandits or local tyrants. Market towns and trading posts sprouted like mushrooms along the major routes. These weren't just places to buy and sell goods. They became cultural melting pots where Chinese scholars debated with Persian philosophers, where European craftsmen learned techniques from Arab artisans. Ideas spread as fast as merchandise. The Mongols also imported foreign expertise to improve their own territories. Chinese engineers built irrigation systems in Central Asia. Persian administrators helped organize taxation in Russia. Arab mathematicians taught in Mongol schools. Trade wasn't just about objects, it was about knowledge, technology, and culture flowing in every direction. Some merchants became incredibly wealthy under Mongol protection. The Polo family wasn't unique, they were just better at writing about their experiences. Thousands of traders made fortunes moving goods across the empire. Some even bought their way into noble titles or advisory positions with local khans. The empire's religious tolerance played a huge role in trade success. Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, and Jewish merchants could all conduct business freely. No one cared what god you prayed to as long as you paid your taxes and didn't cause trouble. This openness attracted traders from everywhere. Markets in major Mongol cities were spectacular affairs. Karakorum's bazaars sold goods from 50 different countries. You could buy Chinese tea, Indian cotton, European amber, and African ivory all in the same afternoon. The variety would put modern shopping malls to shame. Of course, this commercial paradise came with typical Mongol brutality: cheat a customer or shortchange the tax collector, and you might lose more than your merchandise. You might lose body parts, or your life. The Mongols didn't mess around when it came to maintaining order in their markets. This vast trading network would eventually help spread something the Mongols never intended to export: disease. But that's another story entirely. For now, what mattered was that information needed to travel as efficiently as goods and money across this enormous empire. Speed was everything in the Mongol Empire. When your territory stretches from Korea to Hungary, you can't exactly send a text message to coordinate military campaigns or trade deals. The Mongols solved this massive communication problem with one of history's most impressive systems, the yam. This wasn't just some basic postal service. The yam was a military-grade messenger network that could move information faster than anything the world had seen before. Picture relay stations positioned every 25 to 30 miles across thousands of miles of territory. Each station kept fresh horses, food, and supplies ready at all times. Riders would gallop full speed to the next station, leap onto a new horse, and continue without stopping. The numbers were staggering. A single message could travel up to 200 miles in one day. That means news from Beijing could reach the western edge of the empire in just weeks instead of months. Compare that to medieval Europe, where similar distances took forever to cross, and you start to understand why the Mongols dominated everyone else. But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't casual horseback rides through pleasant countryside. Yam riders faced brutal weather, dangerous terrain, and the constant threat of bandits or enemy soldiers. They rode through blizzards that could freeze a person solid, across deserts that baked travelers alive, and over mountain passes where one wrong step meant certain death. The riders themselves were elite athletes. They had to be. Spending 12 to 16 hours a day in the saddle, while maintaining breakneck speeds required incredible endurance and skill. Many riders could sleep while riding, using techniques passed down through generations of nomadic life. They ate dried meat and fermented mare's milk without slowing down, sometimes going days with minimal rest. What made the system truly revolutionary was its organization. Each station maintained detailed records of who passed through, what messages they carried, and exactly when they arrived and departed. Station masters faced severe punishment if supplies ran low or horses weren't properly maintained. The entire network operated like a finely tuned machine, with every component essential to the whole. Then there were the security measures. Yam riders carried special tablets called paidze that granted them absolute authority to demand fresh horses, food and shelter from anyone in the empire. These tablets were like diplomatic passports, but with much more power. Villagers that refused to help a Yam rider faced brutal consequences from Mongol authorities. The types of messages that traveled the Yam reveal how the empire actually functioned. Military orders moved fastest, often coded in ways only trusted generals could understand. Trade information followed close behind. Market prices, caravan schedules, and reports of bandit activity along major routes. Administrative documents kept the vast bureaucracy running, while intelligence reports helped Khans track potential rebellions or foreign threats. Delays carried deadly consequences. A message arriving even one day late could mean a military campaign failed or a trade opportunity vanished. Riders who lost messages or took unauthorized breaks faced execution or exile. Station masters who allowed their horses to become sick or their supplies to spoil met similar fates. The Mongols didn't mess around when it came to communication failures. The Yam also served purposes beyond simple message delivery. Merchants could use the system by paying fees, though they received lower priority than official government business. Diplomatic envoys traveled the network when negotiating with foreign powers. Even family members of high-ranking officials sometimes gained access for personal correspondence. Weather presented the biggest challenge to the entire operation. Mongolian winters could shut down entire sections of the network for weeks at a time. Summer storms turned roads into impassable mud pits. Spring floods washed out bridges and made river crossings impossible. Yet the system kept functioning through most natural disasters, testament to both Mongol engineering and the dedication of its operators. The psychological impact of the Yam was enormous. Enemies knew that attacking one Mongol outpost would bring swift retaliation from forces hundreds of miles away. Merchants gained confidence knowing their trade routes were monitored and protected. Local governors understood they couldn't hide corruption or rebellion from the central government for long. Smart travelers learned to time their journeys around Yam schedules. Following messenger routes offered the safest passage through dangerous territory, even if it meant longer distances. The network created corridors of relative safety across otherwise hostile landscapes. The genius wasn't just in the speed or organization. The Yam represented something bigger. The Mongols' understanding that information was power, and controlling information flow meant controlling an empire. They grasped concepts about communication networks that wouldn't be fully appreciated again until the telegraph age. Of course, even the most efficient messenger system couldn't solve every problem facing people living under Mongol rule. Daily health challenges required very different solutions, and those remedies were often much more primitive than their communication technology. Disease could strike a Mongol camp faster than lightning. One day everyone's healthy, riding horses and tending herds. The next day, half the tribe is burning with fever or doubled over in agony. When sickness hit the steppes, there were no hospitals to rush to, no doctors with fancy degrees, and definitely no pharmacies on every corner. The Mongols had to get creative with whatever nature provided. Willow bark tea helped reduce fevers. Animal fat mixed with certain herbs created salves for wounds. Fermented mare's milk wasn't just a party drink. It supposedly helped with stomach problems too. But here's the thing about medieval medicine. Sometimes the cure was worse than the disease. Some remedies included drinking boiled wolf blood or rubbing bear grease on infected cuts. Yikes. Shamans played a huge role in Mongol healthcare, which meant your recovery often depended on how well someone could chant and dance around a fire. These spiritual healers believed most illnesses came from angry spirits or broken taboos. Got a headache? Maybe you offended an ancestor. Stomach cramps? Perhaps you didn't properly honor the sky god. The shamans would perform elaborate rituals, complete with drumming, singing and animal sacrifices, to appease whatever supernatural forces were making people sick. Well, this approach had its limits. When the Black Death swept through parts of the empire in the 1300s, no amount of chanting could stop the devastation. Entire communities vanished. Trade routes became death traps. Even the mighty Mongol military machine couldn't fight microscopic enemies they couldn't see or understand. Hygiene wasn't exactly a strong point for steppe nomads. Personal cleanliness took a back seat to survival priorities like finding water for the herds and staying warm. Most Mongols went weeks without proper baths, especially during harsh winters when heating water meant using precious fuel. They'd rub themselves down with animal fat to keep skin from cracking in the cold, but this wasn't exactly sterile medical practice. Then there's the issue of battlefield medicine. Mongol warriors regularly came back from raids with arrow wounds, sword cuts and broken bones. Field treatment was brutal and basic. Pour some fermented milk on the wound, wrap it with whatever cloth was available, and hope for the best. Soldiers who couldn't ride anymore often got left behind, harsh but practical for an army that depended on speed and mobility. Infections were absolute killers. A simple cut from a rusty blade could turn deadly within days. Gangrene meant amputation with whatever sharp tools were handy, usually without any pain relief, stronger than a leather strap to bite down on. Many warriors preferred dying in battle to slowly rotting away from infected wounds. Childbirth presented another major health challenge. Mongol women gave birth in their yurts with help from experienced older women, but complications meant almost certain death for mother, child, or both. No cesarean sections, no modern pain relief, no emergency procedures. The infant mortality rate was staggering by today's standards. Food poisoning struck regularly too. Meat spoiled quickly in summer heat, and there was no refrigeration to keep things fresh. Eating bad horse meat or contaminated mare's milk could leave entire families violently ill for days. The Mongols developed some preservation techniques, drying meat into jerky, fermenting dairy products, but these methods weren't foolproof. Mental health was another story entirely. The constant stress of warfare, harsh weather, and nomadic life took its toll on people's minds. But the Mongols didn't recognize depression or anxiety as medical conditions. If someone acted strangely or couldn't function normally, shamans might blame evil spirits or curse-related problems. Interestingly, the Mongols did pick up some medical knowledge from conquered territories. Chinese physicians taught them about acupuncture and herbal remedies. Islamic doctors shared surgical techniques and astronomical-based treatments. Persian healers contributed their own plant-based medicines. The empire's religious tolerance extended to medical practices. They'd try anything that might work. Dental care was practically non-existent. Most adults had missing, broken, or severely worn teeth by middle age. Toothaches were treated by pulling the offending tooth with pliers or hoping it would fall out on its own. Chewing tough dried meat all the time didn't help matters either. Broken bones healed crooked more often than not. Without proper splints or medical knowledge about setting fractures, many Mongols lived with permanent disabilities from poorly healed injuries. A broken leg could end a warrior's career permanently, relegating him to less prestigious work within the tribe. The average lifespan was shockingly short. Maybe 30 to 40 years if you were lucky. Most people died from diseases that modern medicine could easily cure, injuries that today would require simple treatment, or complications from childbirth and infections. But here's what's fascinating. Despite these medical limitations, the Mongols conquered most of the known world. They built the largest empire in human history, while dealing with constant health crises and primitive medical care. It makes you wonder how they managed such incredible military success when staying healthy was already such a daily struggle. Speaking of daily struggles, Mongol women faced unique challenges that went far beyond just medical issues. While we've talked about the brutal laws and warrior culture that defined Mongol society, there's something fascinating that most people miss. Women in the Mongol Empire actually had more rights and freedom than women almost anywhere else in the medieval world. Yeah, you heard that right. In a society famous for conquest and violence, women could own property, lead armies, and make major political decisions. But let's start with the basics first. Most Mongol women spent their days managing the practical side of nomadic life. They milked the animals at dawn, churned butter, and made cheese that could last through long migrations. The weird part is that while men got all the glory for riding and fighting, women basically ran the economy. They controlled the herds when men were away at war. They decided when to move camp. They managed trade negotiations with passing merchants. Women also mastered skills that kept families alive on the harsh steppes. They knew how to tan hides into leather tough enough for winter boots. They could repair a yurt in howling wind and make clothes that wouldn't freeze solid in sub-zero temperatures. Ever try sewing thick leather with bone needles while your fingers are numb? These women did it routinely. Then there's the surprising military side of things. Some Mongol women didn't just wave goodbye when the men rode off to war. They grabbed their bows and joined the fight. Gutulan, a great niece of Kublai Khan, reportedly defeated every male wrestler who challenged her and commanded her own army of 10,000 warriors. She refused to marry any man who couldn't beat her in combat. Smart strategy, honestly. Marriage in Mongol society worked differently than you might expect. Families arranged most marriages to strengthen clan alliances, sure, but Mongol women kept their own names and often their own property after marriage. They could divorce their husbands under certain circumstances. Compare that to medieval Europe, where women became basically their husband's property, and you start to see how revolutionary this was. Let's not forget about widows, who had especially unusual rights for the time period. When a Mongol man died, his widow could inherit his position and wealth. She might become head of the household, controlling vast herds and even commanding troops. Some widows of Khans became regents, ruling entire territories until their sons came of age. Turegin Khatun ruled the entire Mongol Empire for 5 years as regent. 5 years, that's longer than some emperors managed to stay in power. Religious and spiritual roles gave women another avenue to influence. Female shamans held respected positions in Mongol society, conducting rituals and giving advice that even Khans followed. These women claimed to communicate with spirits and ancestors. Their word could determine whether an army marched to war or stayed home. Not exactly powerless, right? But daily life wasn't all political influence and military glory. Most women dealt with the constant challenges of nomadic survival. They gave birth in yurts during blizzards, with no doctors and limited supplies. Infant mortality was brutally high. Many women lost multiple children to disease, cold, or starvation. The emotional toll must have been devastating, yet historical records show they kept functioning and contributing to their communities. Women handled diplomatic duties too. They negotiated with other clans, arranged trade agreements, and sometimes served as ambassadors to foreign courts. The Mongols understood that women could often travel places and have conversations that male warriors couldn't. Enemy leaders might underestimate them, which gave Mongol women diplomatic advantages. Education varied wildly depending on social class. Elite women learned to read and write in multiple languages. They studied poetry, music, and court etiquette. Common women focused on practical skills, but they weren't completely cut off from learning. Oral traditions meant that even illiterate women knew complex stories, songs, and historical accounts that they passed down through generations. The textile work these women produced was absolutely incredible. They created felt so dense it could stop arrows. They wove patterns that told family histories and clan stories. Their carpets and wall hangings turned bare yurts into comfortable homes. This wasn't just busy work either. High-quality textiles were valuable trade goods that could be exchanged for weapons, horses, or food during hard times. Legal protections for women under Mongol law were surprisingly comprehensive. The Asar specifically outlined punishments for men who abused their wives or daughters. Rape carried severe penalties, including death. Female slaves had certain rights that protected them from the worst treatment. Again, this was radically progressive compared to most medieval societies. What made this possible? The nomadic lifestyle demanded that everyone contribute. When your entire community might need to pack up and move at a moment's notice, you can't afford to keep half your population locked away and helpless. Mongol women had to be tough, capable, and ready for anything. Their influence extended far beyond the steppes too. As the empire expanded, Mongol women carried these attitudes into conquered territories, sometimes shocking local populations with their independence and authority. Understanding women's roles gives us a more complete picture of this complex society. But there's another side to Mongol culture that reveals their creative spirit. The Mongols weren't exactly known for their fine arts museums or concert halls. But here's the thing nobody talks about. They actually had a rich cultural life that went way beyond just conquering everyone in sight. Their art, music, and storytelling formed the backbone of their identity, passing down everything from battle tactics to family histories through generations. Music played a huge role in daily Mongol life. The horse-head fiddle, called a morin kua, was their most prized instrument. This 2-stringed fiddle got its name from the carved horse head at the top, and the sound it made could supposedly mimic a horse's neighing. Pretty fitting for a horse-obsessed culture, right? Musicians would play these fiddles around campfires, creating haunting melodies that carried across the steppes for miles. Then there were the epic songs. These weren't your typical 3-minute pop songs, we're talking marathon performances that could last for hours. Professional singers known as bards would travel from tribe to tribe, carrying news, stories, and entertainment all rolled into one package. They memorized thousands of verses about heroic deeds, legendary battles, and the adventures of famous Khans. Think of them as walking, talking newspapers mixed with Netflix. The weird part is how these bards became unofficial historians. Since most Mongols couldn't read or write, these traveling musicians preserved their entire cultural memory. They'd sing about Genghis Khan's rise to power, his greatest victories, and even his failures. No boring textbooks needed, just a guy with a fiddle and an incredible memory. Visual art took on a completely different form in Mongol society. Forget fancy paintings hanging on walls. They didn't have walls to hang anything on anyway. Instead, Mongol artists focused on decorating practical items. They carved intricate designs into their leather saddles, painted geometric patterns on their wooden bowls, and created beautiful metalwork for their weapons and horse gear. Their felt-making skills bordered on artistic genius. The women would create elaborate patterns when making felt for their yurts, using different colored wool to form complex designs. These weren't just pretty decorations, the patterns often told stories or represented important family symbols. A single piece of felt could contain the entire history of a clan, woven right into the fabric. Let's not forget their incredible skill with silver and bronze jewelry. Mongol craftsmen would create ornate belt buckles, hair ornaments, and armbands that served both practical and decorative purposes. The designs often featured animals, eagles, wolves, horses, and dragons, each carrying specific meanings about strength, speed, or spiritual protection. Storytelling was perhaps their greatest art form. Every evening around the fire, families would share tales that had been passed down for generations. These stories served multiple purposes. They entertained, educated, and reinforced cultural values all at the same time. Children learned about bravery through stories of legendary warriors, discovered survival techniques through tales of clever hunters, and understood their place in the tribe through family origin stories. The most popular stories revolved around supernatural creatures and magical events. Tales of shape-shifting shamans, flying horses, and battles between good and evil spirits captivated audiences night after night. But here's what made Mongol storytelling unique. They constantly adapted these stories to include recent events. A traditional tale about a heroic warrior might suddenly feature details from a recent battle, making ancient legends feel fresh and relevant. Some stories served as unofficial law books. Complex moral dilemmas would be explored through fictional characters, teaching listeners about justice, loyalty, and proper behavior without boring lectures. A story about a warrior who betrayed his Khan would end badly, sending a clear message about the consequences of disloyalty. Poetry also flourished in Mongol culture, though it was almost always performed rather than written down. Poets would compete at festivals, improvising verses about current events, praising powerful leaders, or mocking their enemies. The best poets gained fame across multiple tribes, and could earn significant wealth through their performances. Religious art blended seamlessly with their shamanistic beliefs. Shamans would create elaborate ceremonial masks, drums decorated with mystical symbols, and ritual objects that were considered both artistic masterpieces and sacred tools. These items weren't just pretty to look at. They were believed to possess actual spiritual power. But here's what's really fascinating about Mongol artistic expression. It was completely portable. Everything they created had to pack up quickly and survive constant travel. This limitation actually pushed their creativity in unique directions, forcing them to develop art forms that were both beautiful and incredibly durable. Their artistic traditions also reflected their military culture. Victory songs celebrated successful raids, war dances prepared warriors for battle, and commemorative items honored fallen heroes. Art wasn't separate from their warrior lifestyle. It was completely integrated into every aspect of their society. While the Mongols mastered these cultural arts, they faced an even greater challenge that tested every aspect of their society, organizing massive celebrations that could unite entire tribes and boost morale after grueling campaigns. When life on the steppes got brutal, and it got brutal often, the Mongols knew exactly how to blow off steam. These weren't people who sat around feeling sorry for themselves. They threw parties that would make modern festivals look like quiet tea parties. Archery contests dominated every major celebration. But we're not talking about some casual backyard target practice here. Mongol archers could hit a moving target from horseback while galloping at full speed. During festivals, they'd set up competitions that tested skills most people couldn't even imagine attempting. Riders would charge past targets barely the size of dinner plates, releasing arrows with deadly precision. Miss your shot. The crowd would roar with laughter and mockery. Hit a bullseye while your horse jumped over an obstacle, you'd become a legend for months. Wrestling matches followed different rules than what you might expect. Mongol wrestling wasn't just about brute strength. It demanded strategy, balance, and endurance that could last for hours. Wrestlers wore special leather jackets and shorts, grappling until one fighter's back touched the ground. Champions earned respect that extended far beyond the wrestling circle. A skilled wrestler could negotiate better marriages for their children, claim better grazing lands, or even advise the Khan on military matters. Then there were the horse races that pushed both animal and rider to their absolute limits. These weren't short sprints around a track. Mongol horse races covered distances that would exhaust modern marathon runners. Children as young as 6 years old participated, riding bareback across terrain that would challenge experienced adult riders. The winning horse earned prestige for its entire family, while the rider gained status that could change their social position permanently. Let's not forget that food became the centerpiece of every major celebration. When Mongols decided to feast, they didn't mess around with small portions or polite dining etiquette. Entire herds of sheep and goats would be slaughtered for a single festival. The meat got roasted over massive fires that could be seen from miles away. Fermented mare's milk flowed like water, and the stronger the brew, the more popular it became with the celebrating crowds. Music and dancing erupted spontaneously throughout these gatherings. Mongols played stringed instruments that produced haunting melodies perfectly suited to the vast open steppes. The songs told stories of great battles, legendary heroes, and romantic adventures that had been passed down through generations. Everyone joined the singing, from the youngest children to the oldest grandparents. Dancing involved complex movements that mimicked horseback riding, hunting, and combat techniques. But here's where things got really interesting. Gambling became a serious part of festival entertainment. Mongols would bet on everything: which wrestler would win, whose horse would finish first, who could drink the most fermented milk without falling over. Some families won or lost entire herds during a single night of celebration. The stakes were real, and the consequences could change lives forever. Storytelling competitions challenged participants to recite epic tales from memory without making a single mistake. These weren't short bedtime stories either. Some tales took hours to tell properly, with complex plots involving dozens of characters and intricate details about battles, betrayals, and heroic deeds. The best storytellers could hold audiences spellbound until dawn, weaving narratives that seemed to transport listeners directly into the action. Seasonal festivals marked important transitions in nomadic life. Spring celebrations welcomed new births in the herds and marked the beginning of fresh grazing seasons. Summer festivals occurred during the peak traveling months when multiple tribes might gather in the same area. Autumn celebrations prepared communities for the harsh winter months ahead, while winter festivals provided crucial psychological relief during the darkest, coldest periods. Victory celebrations after successful military campaigns reached levels of excess that shocked even hardened warriors. These parties could last for weeks, with continuous feasting, drinking, and entertainment. Captured treasure would be displayed and distributed among the troops. Enemy weapons became trophies that decorated celebration areas. The Khan himself might participate in wrestling matches or archery contests, showing that even the most powerful leaders needed to prove their skills publicly. And the weird part is that religious ceremonies often blended seamlessly with these secular celebrations. Shamans would perform rituals asking for good fortune, successful hunts, and protection from enemies. Buddhist monks might offer prayers alongside traditional Mongol spiritual practices. Christian priests could bless the festivities without anyone finding it strange or contradictory. Women played crucial roles in organizing and maintaining these celebrations. They prepared the massive amounts of food, crafted decorative items for the festivals, and often served as judges for various competitions. Some women even participated directly in archery contests and horse races, competing alongside men and earning respect through their demonstrated skills. The alcohol consumption during these festivals would probably hospitalize most modern partygoers. Fermented mare's milk wasn't the only beverage available. The Mongols also produced strong spirits that could knock out even experienced drinkers. Yet somehow they managed to maintain enough coordination for complex competitions and activities. But festivities served purposes beyond simple entertainment. They reinforced social bonds that kept nomadic communities functioning under extreme pressure. Next, we'll explore how these same people structured their daily routines when the party ended. Your alarm clock doesn't exist. Neither does your snooze button. In the Mongol Empire, dawn breaks with the sound of animals stirring, wind rattling your yurt, and the urgent need to keep everyone alive for another day. Sleep ends when survival begins. The first person awake usually tends the fire. Without it, you're looking at frozen water, cold food, and a miserable start to an already tough day. Building that fire back up from dying embers takes skill. Mongols kept fires burning low through the night, banking coals under ash to preserve heat. Smart move when temperatures drop to bone-crushing levels and finding dry fuel becomes a nightmare. While someone coaxes flames back to life, others head straight to the animals. Horses need checking first. These aren't pets lounging in comfortable stables. They're survival tools that spent the night exposed to weather, predators, and potential thieves. A sick horse could mean death for its rider. A stolen horse definitely meant trouble for the entire family. Then comes milking time. Mares, goats, and sheep don't wait for you to feel ready. They need milking at specific times, and delays can reduce milk production or cause health problems for the animals. Mongol women typically handled this task, moving efficiently between animals while men prepared weapons and checked equipment. But here's where things get interesting. Morning routines shifted completely based on the season and current situation. During peaceful times, mornings might include leisurely conversations and unhurried meals. During military campaigns, dawn meant instant readiness for battle or rapid movement. The routine adapted, but the core survival tasks never changed. Breakfast wasn't a sit-down affair with coffee and newspapers. Mongols ate dried meat, cheese, and sometimes leftover stew from the previous night. Quick, portable, and filling. They drank fermented mare's milk if available, or plain milk when fresh supplies ran low. Everything designed for people who might need to pack up and leave within hours. Morning hunting expeditions served multiple purposes. Fresh meat obviously, but also military training. Young men practiced archery while pursuing game. They learned to work together, track prey across difficult terrain, and make split-second decisions. Every hunt prepared them for war. Trading activities often began in the morning hours when energy levels ran high. Mongol merchants loaded pack animals, checked trade goods, and planned routes to nearby settlements. These weren't casual business trips. Traders faced bandits, harsh weather, and the constant risk of political changes that could turn profitable ventures into deadly mistakes. Women spent morning hours on essential maintenance tasks, repairing clothes, mending equipment, and preparing materials for tent repairs. Nothing got wasted. Every scrap of leather, piece of rope, or metal fragment had potential uses. When you live without hardware stores or online shopping, resourcefulness becomes a survival skill. Afternoons brought different challenges. Heat, when present, made heavy work more difficult. Cold weather limited outdoor activities. Mongols adapted by shifting their most demanding tasks to morning hours and using afternoons for detailed work that required patience rather than physical strength. Weapon maintenance consumed significant afternoon time. Bows needed restringing, arrows required sharpening, and armor demanded constant attention. Neglecting equipment could prove fatal during the next battle or hunting expedition. Every warrior maintained his gear personally, understanding exactly how each piece functioned. Let's not forget the endless cycle of repairs that kept nomadic life functioning. Saddles wore out from constant use. Tent ropes stretched and snapped. Cooking pots developed holes. Afternoon hours offered time to address these problems before they became disasters. Evening brought the community together around fires. Stories, songs, and shared meals created social bonds that held clans together during difficult times. But even relaxation served practical purposes. Storytelling preserved history, taught lessons, and reinforced cultural values. Entertainment wasn't separate from education. Guard duty interrupted sleep for everyone. Mongols rotated watch responsibilities, ensuring someone stayed alert throughout the night. Guards watched for wild animals, enemy raiders, and weather changes that might threaten the camp. Missing your watch shift wasn't just irresponsible, it endangered everyone. Weather emergencies could shatter any routine instantly. Sudden storms meant everyone worked frantically to secure animals and equipment. Unexpected temperature drops required immediate action to prevent frostbite and hypothermia. The daily routine always bent around survival needs. Sleep itself was strategic. Mongols often slept in shifts during dangerous periods, keeping some people alert while others rested. They slept fully clothed during military campaigns, ready to fight or flee at a moment's notice. Comfort took second place to survival. This relentless cycle of survival tasks left little room for boredom or leisure. Every day demanded complete attention to staying alive, keeping animals healthy, and maintaining equipment. The routine was harsh, but it worked. Yet this demanding daily life created something remarkable, a society of incredibly tough, adaptable people who could thrive in conditions that would kill most others. Their routine wasn't just about surviving another day, it was training for conquest on a scale the world had never seen. But that demanding lifestyle came with a price few outsiders could understand or endure. Education in the Mongol Empire wasn't exactly what you'd call a Harvard experience. Most Mongol children never saw the inside of a classroom, and honestly, they wouldn't have known what to do with one anyway. The steppes were their school, and survival was the only subject that really mattered. Common Mongol kids learned everything they needed from watching their parents and older relatives. No textbooks, no homework, no stressed-out teachers trying to explain algebra. Instead, a 5-year-old boy would wake up and immediately start learning how to handle horses by copying his father's every move. Girls watched their mothers milk animals and work with felt, picking up these essential skills through pure observation and practice. Reading and writing. That was luxury stuff reserved for the elite. Your average herder couldn't read a single word, and frankly didn't need to. Why learn to read when you needed to know which direction the wind was blowing, how to track animals across vast grasslands, or when a storm was coming? These practical skills kept you alive, while reading kept you, well, reading. But here's where it gets interesting. The Mongol leadership understood that running a massive empire required more than just knowing how to shoot arrows from horseback. Elite children, especially those from noble families, received an entirely different kind of education. They learned to read and write in Mongol script, which had been adapted from the Uyghur alphabet. Some even picked up multiple languages: Chinese, Persian, Arabic, depending on which conquered territories their families controlled. These privileged kids had actual tutors, often captured scholars or monks who had been pressed into service. Makes sense, right? You conquer a city, you might as well put the smart people to work teaching your children. The Mongols were practical like that. They didn't waste useful resources, whether those resources were gold, horses, or brilliant mathematicians from Baghdad. Traveling monks sometimes provided education to common children, but this was hit or miss. A Buddhist monk might roll through your area and teach a few kids to read basic texts, or a Christian missionary might offer lessons in exchange for food and shelter, but you couldn't count on it, and most families were too busy with daily survival to spare their children for formal learning anyway. The knowledge that really mattered in Mongol society was military and practical. Boys learned archery not through boring drills, but by competing with friends and older brothers. They absorbed battle tactics by listening to warriors tell stories around the fire. Every tale of conquest contained lessons about strategy, timing, and leadership. This wasn't book learning, it was experiential education that prepared them for real combat situations. Girls received their own form of specialized education focused on managing households and understanding animal husbandry. They learned to identify sick animals, prepare different types of food, and create clothing that would last through brutal winters. These weren't simple domestic skills, they were complex knowledge systems that required years to master. Let's not forget the oral tradition that served as the Mongols' living library. Elders memorized vast amounts of information about genealogies, laws, historical events, and geographical knowledge. A single elder might carry in their head detailed information about water sources across thousands of miles, the locations of good grazing areas, and the complete family histories of dozens of clans. Children absorbed this information gradually, almost unconsciously, through daily conversations and storytelling sessions. By the time they reached adulthood, they possessed an incredibly detailed mental map of their world that no written textbook could have provided. The weird part is how effective this education system was for its specific environment. Mongol graduates could navigate vast distances without maps, survive in conditions that would kill most people, and adapt quickly to new situations. Their educational approach produced some of the most capable administrators, generals, and diplomats in medieval history. Record-keeping became more important as the empire expanded, creating demand for literate administrators. The Mongols often promoted educated captives to handle paperwork and correspondence, but they also began training more of their own people in writing and mathematics. Still, this remained limited to those who showed special aptitude or came from influential families. Religious education varied wildly, depending on which part of the empire you lived in, and what faiths were dominant there. Some Mongol children learned Buddhist texts, others studied Islamic law, and some encountered Christian teachings. The empire's religious tolerance meant that educational opportunities often came through whatever religious institutions happened to be nearby. The contrast between common and elite education created an interesting social dynamic. Most people remained functionally illiterate, but possessed deep practical knowledge, while a small educated class managed the complex administrative needs of governing conquered territories. This educational divide would eventually contribute to changes in Mongol society, as literate administrators gained influence and traditional nomadic skills became less crucial for success. But that transformation would take generations to fully unfold. The empire's unique approach to learning shaped not just individuals, but entire cultures across Eurasia, though few realized how these educational choices would influence their society's future stability. Living under Mongol rule wasn't exactly a fairy tale existence. While the empire connected distant lands and created trade opportunities, the reality for millions of people was far more brutal than any history textbook might suggest. The Mongols built their massive empire on a foundation of fear, violence, and exploitation that left entire populations struggling to survive. War never really ended in the Mongol world. Even after initial conquests, communities faced constant military campaigns as the empire expanded or dealt with rebellions. Young men got ripped away from their families to serve in distant battles. Fields went unplanted because farmers were either dead, enslaved, or forced into military service. Entire villages could be emptied overnight when the Khan needed more soldiers for his next campaign. Then there's the devastating impact on agriculture. Nomadic Mongols didn't understand farming the way settled peoples did. They'd ride their horses right through carefully tended crops without a second thought. Sometimes they'd deliberately destroy farmland to create more pasture for their herds. When harvest season came and the crops were ruined, famine followed quickly. People starved while Mongol warriors moved on to their next target. The tax burden was absolutely crushing. Conquered territories had to pay tribute in gold, silver, livestock and grain. But that wasn't all mites. They also had to provide free labor, housing for Mongol officials, and supplies for passing armies. Local populations were squeezed until they had almost nothing left. Many families sold their children into slavery, just to pay the taxes demanded by their new rulers. Rebellions happened frequently, but the Mongol response was always swift and merciless. When a city dared to resist, the entire population might be slaughtered as an example to others. The Mongols perfected psychological warfare through mass executions. They'd line up thousands of captives and kill them systematically, leaving pyramids of skulls as warnings. Whole bloodlines got wiped out for the actions of a few rebels. Border regions lived in constant terror of raids. Mongol warriors didn't just attack during major campaigns. They launched smaller raids throughout the year to capture slaves, steal livestock, and keep neighboring populations afraid. Farmers near the frontier couldn't predict when horsemen might appear over the horizon, ready to burn their homes and drag away their families. This constant threat made normal life nearly impossible. Let's not forget the complete disruption of traditional societies. Ancient customs, local laws and religious practices all got trampled under Mongol boots. Local leaders were replaced with Mongol governors, who had no understanding of regional needs or customs. Communities that had governed themselves for centuries suddenly found themselves under foreign military occupation, with no say in their own affairs. The forced relocations were particularly devastating. Mongols regularly moved entire populations from one region to another to prevent organized resistance. Skilled craftsmen got dragged thousands of miles from their homes to work in Mongol territories. Families were separated permanently. People lost their ancestral lands, their cultural connections, and often their will to live. Disease spread rapidly along the new trade routes. While merchants celebrated the connected empire, deadly plagues traveled just as easily as silk and spices. The Mongol military movements helped spread epidemics across vast distances. Populations with no immunity to foreign diseases died in massive numbers. The famous trade networks that historians praise today were also highways for death. Women and children suffered especially during conquests. Mongol warriors considered captive women as spoils of war. Children were enslaved or adopted into Mongol families, losing their original identities completely. Pregnant women faced particular dangers during the chaos of invasion and occupation. Family structures that had existed for generations got destroyed in a matter of days. Even the famous religious tolerance had dark sides. While the Mongols didn't force one religion on everyone, they did demand absolute political loyalty. Religious leaders who spoke against Mongol rule faced execution regardless of their faith. Temples and monasteries had to pay heavy taxes despite their supposed protection. The tolerance was more about control than genuine respect for different beliefs. The economic disruption went far beyond simple taxation. Traditional trade routes got redirected to benefit Mongol interests. Local merchants found themselves competing with Mongol-backed traders who had unfair advantages. Craft guilds were broken up and reformed under Mongol supervision. The economic systems that had supported communities for centuries were twisted to serve the empire's military needs. But here's what made it even worse. There was no end in sight. Unlike other conquerors who might eventually settle down and become part of local society, the Mongols maintained their warrior culture and nomadic outlook. They saw settled populations as resources to be exploited, not as people to govern fairly. The threat of violence and exploitation was permanent. The constant fear created a society where trust disappeared. Neighbors might become informants to gain favor with Mongol officials. Children were encouraged to report on their parents. Community bonds that had provided support during difficult times got shattered by suspicion and betrayal. Yet despite all these harsh realities, some communities did find ways to adapt and even thrive under Mongol rule. But survival required understanding not just the brutal facts of conquest, but also the strange myths and legends that shaped how Mongols saw themselves and their place in the world. Superstition ruled the Mongol world as much as any Khan ever did. Their entire universe was filled with spirits, omens and mythical creatures that could make or break a warrior's destiny. But these weren't just bedtime stories. These beliefs shaped military strategy, daily decisions, and even the rise of the greatest empire in history. The most famous legend, the sacred white owl that supposedly saved Genghis Khan's life. When enemies were hunting young Temujin through the wilderness, he hid behind a tree. An owl perched on a branch above him. His pursuers saw the bird and thought, no human could be hiding here. The owl would have flown away. They rode past. This owl became a symbol of divine protection, and Mongol warriors carried owl feathers into battle, believing they made them invisible to enemies. Pretty clever psychological warfare when your opponents think you're protected by magical birds. Creation myths were passed down through generations with deadly seriousness. According to Mongol legend, their people descended from a blue-grey wolf and a fallow deer who met at the sacred Birken Koldun mountain. This wasn't just a nice origin story. It meant every Mongol carried wolf blood, making them natural predators destined to hunt and conquer. Warriors would howl before charging into battle, channeling their mythical wolf ancestor. The eternal blue sky, called Tengri, watched over everything. Mongols believed this sky god personally chose Genghis Khan to rule the world. Every military campaign became a holy mission blessed by heaven itself. When enemies surrendered, they weren't just submitting to Mongol power, they were acknowledging the will of the eternal blue sky. Resistance meant fighting against divine mandate, which explained why the Mongols showed such brutal efficiency in crushing rebellions. Weather omens controlled daily life with iron certainty. A sudden storm meant angry spirits, lightning striking near camp, time to move immediately. Cloud formations predicted everything from battle outcomes to the best grazing spots. Shamans studied the sky like modern meteorologists, but they were reading spiritual messages instead of atmospheric pressure. Their predictions carried life or death weight because wrong interpretations could doom entire tribes. Animal behavior revealed hidden truths about the future. Horses acting nervous meant enemies were approaching, or evil spirits were gathering. Birds flying in certain patterns predicted victory or defeat. Even the way sheep scattered while grazing told shamans about upcoming weather changes. These weren't random superstitions either. Animals do sense things humans miss. So some of these beliefs had practical value wrapped in mythical explanations. Dreams held enormous power over military decisions. Before major battles, Khans consulted dream interpreters who analyzed every symbol. Dreaming of a white horse meant divine favor. Black horses, bad luck ahead. Some campaigns were delayed or abandoned entirely because of troubling dream visions. Genghis Khan himself reportedly changed battle plans based on dreams, proving that even the most successful conqueror in history trusted mystical guidance over pure strategy. Fire spirits demanded constant respect and specific rituals. Mongols believed flames contained living beings that could bless or curse their families. Spilling water on fire was considered a serious crime that brought disaster. When cooking, they offered the first portions to fire spirits before feeding themselves. These flames weren't just tools for warmth and cooking, they were household gods that required daily worship and careful treatment. The number 9 held sacred significance throughout Mongol culture. 9 white horses were sacrificed at important ceremonies. Warriors carried 9 arrows for luck. Major rituals repeated actions 9 times. This mystical number appeared in everything from military formations to marriage customs. Breaking the pattern of 9 could supposedly anger the spirits and doom any undertaking. Sacred mountains dotted the landscape like spiritual fortresses. Birken Koldun, where Genghis Khan was supposedly born, remained forbidden to outsiders for centuries. These peaks were considered dwelling places of powerful spirits who controlled weather, hunting success and tribal fortune. Climbing sacred mountains without permission could result in death, not from human punishment, but from supernatural revenge. Then there were the shape-shifting demons that haunted the steppes. These creatures supposedly took animal forms to trick travelers into getting lost or ambushed. Every unexplained disappearance, every sudden illness, every mysterious death was blamed on these supernatural predators. All warriors carried protective amulets and recited specific prayers when traveling through dangerous territories where demons were known to lurk. Blood brotherhood rituals mixed myth with political reality. Warriors who wanted to form unbreakable alliances would cut themselves and mix their blood while invoking ancient spirits. This created supernatural bonds that were considered stronger than family ties. Breaking blood brotherhood brought curses that would destroy entire bloodlines for generations. But perhaps the strangest part was how these myths actually worked. Mongol armies fought with absolutely ruthless confidence because they believed heaven itself guaranteed their victory. Their enemies often surrendered before fighting because Mongol supernatural reputation preceded their military reputation. These weren't just entertaining stories told around campfires. Every myth, every superstition, every legendary creature shaped how millions of people lived, fought, and died. Yet, what happened when these believers encountered the rigid structures of conquered cities? When the Mongols conquered a city, they didn't just ride through and leave. They stayed, they watched. They controlled every breath you took. Life in a conquered city under Mongol rule was like living in a perfectly organized prison, where the guards spoke a different language and carried really sharp swords. The Mongols had this genius system. They'd keep local leaders in power, but only as puppets. Your mayor, still there. Your judge, still making decisions. But standing right behind them was always a Mongol official, with his hand resting casually on his weapon. The surveillance was insane. Spies everywhere, that friendly merchant selling bread, probably reporting to the Mongols about who complained about taxes. Your neighbor asking too many questions about the new laws, could be gathering information for the authorities. Trust became a luxury most people couldn't afford. But here's where it gets interesting. The Mongols were surprisingly practical about city management. They didn't want chaos. Chaos meant rebellion, and rebellion meant they'd have to waste time and soldiers putting it down. Instead, they created order through fear, mixed with opportunity. Local administrators who cooperated got rewarded. Wealth, position, protection. The Mongols weren't stupid about human nature. They knew that giving certain people a stake in the new system made their job easier. Some local leaders found themselves richer under Mongol rule than they'd ever been before. The building projects were massive. Cities that had been damaged during conquest got rebuilt, often better than before. The Mongols understood that prosperous cities meant more tax revenue. Destroyed neighborhoods rose again with improved roads, better drainage systems, and stronger walls. It wasn't kindness, it was business sense. Urban workers faced constant scrutiny though. Every guild, every craft workshop, every market stall operated under Mongol oversight. Production quotas, quality standards, delivery schedules, everything monitored and recorded. Fail to meet expectations and you'd face punishment that ranged from heavy fines to something much worse. Then there's the taxation system. Brutal doesn't begin to describe it. The Mongols extracted wealth from cities like water from a sponge. They squeezed until nothing more came out, then squeezed harder. Regular taxes, special levies, tribute payments, military contributions, the demands never stopped. Families that had been comfortable for generations suddenly found themselves scraping together coins just to survive. Wealthy merchants discovered something fascinating though. While the tax burden was crushing, the trade opportunities were incredible. The Mongol Empire stretched from China to Eastern Europe, creating the largest free trade zone in history. A silk merchant in Baghdad could now send goods directly to customers in Beijing without worrying about dozens of different rulers, currencies, and border guards. The Mongol passport system protected traders across thousands of miles. Street life adapted in weird ways. Traditional festivals continued, but with Mongol observers taking notes. Religious ceremonies happened as usual, but with subtle changes to avoid anything that might be seen as rebellious. People learned to celebrate quietly, to complain in whispers, and to smile when Mongol officials passed by. The legal system became a confusing mix of local customs and Mongol law. Steal a horse, that fell under Mongol military law, and meant death. Cheat on your spouse, local courts still handled that. But nobody was quite sure where the lines were drawn, which kept everyone nervous and compliant. Children growing up in conquered cities lived in two worlds. At home, parents taught them local traditions, language, and customs. In public, they learned to bow properly to Mongol officials and recite loyalty oaths. Some kids became translators and intermediaries, building careers out of bridging the cultural gap. The really smart families found ways to make themselves indispensable: scribes who could write in multiple languages, craftsmen who could produce goods to Mongol specifications, doctors who could treat both Mongol and local patients. These people thrived. Adaptation meant survival, and survival sometimes led to prosperity. What's fascinating is how different cities had different experiences. Surrender immediately when the Mongols approached. You got relatively gentle treatment. Fight back, your city might be completely destroyed and rebuilt from scratch with entirely new residents. The Mongols had long memories and made examples that other cities couldn't forget. Markets bustled with activity, but the conversations were different. Merchants discussed prices and quality in careful, neutral terms. Political talk disappeared almost entirely. People learned to read the mood of their Mongol overseers and adjust their behavior accordingly. Flexibility became a survival skill. The Mongols were brilliant at using local knowledge while maintaining control. They kept detailed records of everything: population numbers, tax revenues, production levels, potential troublemakers. Information flowed up the chain of command with remarkable efficiency. Living in these cities meant constantly balancing old traditions with new realities. But what happened when the Mongols decided your city needed to contribute more than just taxes to the empire? The demands for innovation and technology would reshape entire civilizations. The Mongols weren't just fierce warriors riding around on horses. They were actually brilliant innovators who created some of the most advanced technology of their time. Their inventions weren't flashy gadgets, but practical tools that helped them dominate half the known world. Start with their famous composite bows. These weren't simple wooden sticks with strings attached. Mongol craftsmen layered horn, wood and sinew together to create weapons that could shoot arrows over 200 meters with deadly accuracy. The horn provided flexibility, wood gave structure, and animal sinew added incredible tension. When fully drawn, these bows generated enough force to punch through chainmail armor. European knights, who thought they were invincible in their heavy metal suits, quickly learned otherwise when Mongol arrows started flying. But here's the crazy part about these bows: they were small enough to use while galloping at full speed on horseback. Try shooting a regular bow while bouncing around on a moving horse. You'll probably hit everything except your target. Mongol warriors practiced this combination until it became second nature, turning their entire cavalry into mobile artillery units that could strike from impossible distances. Then there's the engineering marvel nobody talks about enough: the yurt. These portable homes weren't just tents thrown together with leftover materials. They represented centuries of refined engineering, designed to survive the harshest conditions on Earth. The circular design distributed wind pressure evenly, preventing collapse during brutal steppe storms. The lattice framework could be assembled or dismantled in less than an hour by an experienced family. The genius lay in the details. Horsehair ropes held everything together because they stretched and contracted with temperature changes without breaking. Felt walls provided insulation that kept families warm when outside temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. The central smoke hole could be adjusted for weather conditions, and the entire structure weighed little enough to transport on just a few pack animals. Let's not forget their revolutionary wagon technology. Mongol wagons weren't simple wooden carts that fell apart after a few miles. These vehicles were built to carry entire households across thousands of miles of rough terrain. They had flexible suspension systems made from woven leather straps that absorbed shocks from rocks and holes. The wheels were reinforced with iron bands, and the axles were designed to be easily replaced when they broke. Some of these wagons were massive. Historical accounts describe Mongol families with wagons so large they needed 20 oxen to pull them. The biggest ones housed entire extended families and could be up to 30 feet wide. Imagine rolling down the highway in a house on wheels. That's basically what wealthy Mongol families did across the steppes. Their map-making skills were centuries ahead of their time. While European maps still showed dragons and mythical creatures in unknown regions, Mongol cartographers were creating detailed, accurate maps of trade routes spanning continents. They documented water sources, mountain passes, seasonal grazing areas, and enemy territories with precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 200 years. Mongol administrators also developed sophisticated census systems that tracked population numbers, livestock counts, and tax obligations across their massive empire. They created standardized record-keeping methods that allowed information to flow efficiently from remote villages to the imperial capital. This wasn't just bureaucratic paperwork, it was advanced data management that helped coordinate the largest land empire in human history. Their metallurgy techniques produced weapons and armor that combined strength with flexibility. Mongol blacksmiths knew how to create steel that could bend without breaking and hold sharp edges through countless battles. They developed specialized techniques for working with different metals, creating everything from arrowheads to horse bits to decorative jewelry. The weird part is how they spread technology wherever they conquered. Instead of keeping innovations secret, Mongols actively transplanted useful techniques from one region to another. Chinese gunpowder technology traveled west, Islamic astronomical instruments moved east, and European engineering methods spread across Asia. They created the world's first large-scale technology transfer network. Their medical instruments might seem primitive by modern standards, but they were incredibly advanced for their time. Mongol healers used specialized tools for treating arrow wounds, bone fractures, and battlefield injuries. They developed portable surgical kits that could be carried on horseback and used in emergency situations far from any permanent settlement. Weather prediction technology helped them survive the unpredictable steppe climate. Experienced Mongols could read wind patterns, cloud formations, and animal behavior to predict storms, temperature changes, and seasonal variations with remarkable accuracy. This wasn't superstition. It was systematic observation refined over generations of nomadic life. All this innovation came from necessity rather than academic curiosity. Every piece of Mongol technology solved a real problem they faced while conquering and controlling their empire. But technology alone couldn't protect them from the invisible enemies that would eventually threaten their civilization. After surviving battles, harsh winters, and brutal laws, Mongols faced their most invisible enemy yet. Disease stalked their empire like a silent predator, and when it struck, even the mightiest warriors fell helpless. The cramped conditions of military camps created perfect breeding grounds for illness. Thousands of soldiers sleeping close together, sharing contaminated water sources, and eating questionable food. One sick person could infect an entire army within days. Dysentery ran rampant through the ranks, turning fierce warriors into weakened shadows of themselves. The irony, men who could charge into battle fearlessly were defeated by microscopic enemies they couldn't even see. Village life wasn't much safer. When families huddled together in yurts during freezing winters, respiratory infections spread like wildfire. A single cough could doom everyone inside that felt shelter. Parents watched helplessly as their children developed fevers that wouldn't break. The close quarters that kept them warm also sealed their fate when sickness arrived. But here's where it gets really dark. Mongols had virtually no understanding of how diseases actually spread. They believed illness came from angry spirits or broken taboos. Some thought bad air caused sickness, which wasn't entirely wrong, but they missed the real culprits entirely. No one connected dirty hands to stomach problems. Nobody realized that contaminated water sources were killing more people than enemy arrows. Their medical knowledge consisted mainly of herbal remedies passed down through generations. Shamans mixed animal fat with crushed plants, creating pastes that rarely did much good. They performed elaborate rituals, chanting over sick patients and burning special herbs to drive away evil spirits. Sometimes these ceremonies provided comfort, but they couldn't cure pneumonia or stop the spread of plague. The empire's vast trade networks, which brought wealth and prosperity, also became highways for disease transmission. Merchants traveling the Silk Road carried more than silk and spices in their cargo. They transported smallpox, typhus, and other deadly infections across thousands of miles. A trader infected in Baghdad could spread his illness all the way to Beijing without anyone understanding how. Then there's the matter of hygiene, or rather the complete lack of it. Mongols rarely bathed, especially during winter months when water froze solid. They wore the same clothes for weeks, creating perfect environments for parasites and bacteria. Lice infestations were so common that people barely noticed them anymore. These tiny creatures carried typhus, turning a simple pest problem into a life-threatening epidemic. Food poisoning struck regularly because proper food storage was nearly impossible during long migrations. Meat spoiled quickly in summer heat, but hungry families ate it anyway rather than waste precious protein. Milk products fermented in unpredictable ways, sometimes producing beneficial probiotics, other times creating toxic bacteria that caused violent illness. When someone did fall seriously ill, the Mongol approach was surprisingly practical in some ways. Families immediately isolated sick members to prevent further spread, though they didn't understand why this helped. They just knew from experience that keeping diseased people separate sometimes stopped others from getting sick. This accidental quarantine method probably saved countless lives. Pregnant women faced especially dire circumstances during disease outbreaks. With no medical professionals and limited understanding of childbirth complications, many mothers and babies died from preventable causes. Infection after delivery was extremely common, and there was little anyone could do except hope and pray to their various gods. The empire's religious tolerance actually helped during medical crises. Buddhist monks, Islamic scholars, and Christian missionaries all brought different healing traditions. Some of these foreign medical practices were more effective than traditional Mongol remedies. Chinese acupuncture, Persian surgical techniques, and European herbal knowledge slowly filtered into Mongol territories through conquest and trade. Death, when it finally came, triggered elaborate burial rituals that blended religious beliefs with practical necessity.
Ooh.
Mongols traditionally buried their dead in unmarked graves to prevent enemies from desecrating them. During plague outbreaks, this practice accidentally helped prevent further disease transmission by keeping infected corpses away from the living. The psychological impact of constant disease threats shaped Mongol attitudes toward life and death. They developed a fatalistic worldview where survival depended more on luck than planning. This mindset made them incredibly brave in battle, but also somewhat careless about basic health precautions. What's truly remarkable is how the empire continued functioning despite these massive health challenges. Armies kept marching even when half their soldiers were sick. Trade routes remained active during epidemic outbreaks. The Mongol machine ground forward relentlessly, powered by sheer determination and an endless supply of replacement personnel from the steppes. Disease ultimately contributed to the empire's eventual decline, though it took centuries to fully manifest. Weakened populations, disrupted trade, and military forces depleted by illness all played their part. But before that collapse came, something even more significant was building. The empire was reaching its absolute peak, stretching across more territory than any land-based empire in human history. The year 1279 marked something extraordinary in human history. The Mongol Empire reached its absolute peak, stretching from Korea in the east to Hungary in the west. We're talking about roughly 24 million square kilometers of controlled territory. That's bigger than the entire continent of North America. No empire before or since has controlled that much continuous land. But here's where things get interesting. Success became the empire's worst enemy. Kublai Khan had just finished conquering the Song dynasty in China, completing what his grandfather Genghis Khan started decades earlier. The Mongols now controlled every major trade route between Europe and Asia. Silk, spices, gold, and ideas flowed through their territories like water through a massive funnel. The wealth was staggering, yet this very success planted the seeds of destruction. The empire had grown too big to manage as one unit. Think about it. Sending a message from Beijing to Baghdad took months, even with their famous Yam postal system. A rebellion could start, spread, and cause massive damage before the Great Khan even heard about it. Distance became their enemy. Then there's the cultural problem nobody talks about. The Mongols were brilliant at conquering, but governing settled populations, that's a completely different skill set. In China, Kublai Khan had to learn Chinese customs and work with Confucian scholars. In Persia, his relatives dealt with Islamic law and traditions. In Russia, they navigated Orthodox Christianity and local princes. Each region demanded different approaches. The original Mongol way of life started disappearing. Warriors who once lived in yurts and moved with the seasons now lived in palaces. They wore silk robes instead of leather armor. Their children spoke Chinese, Persian, or Arabic better than Mongolian. The very thing that made them unstoppable was their nomadic warrior culture was vanishing. Wars between Mongol factions became inevitable. The empire officially split into 4 separate khanates by the 1260s. The Yuan dynasty controlled China and Mongolia. The Ilkhanate ruled Persia and parts of the Middle East. The Golden Horde dominated Russia and Eastern Europe. The Chagatai Khanate held Central Asia. Each claimed to be the legitimate heir to Genghis Khan's legacy. But wait, it gets messier. These weren't friendly family divisions. The different khanates fought each other constantly. The Golden Horde battled the Ilkhanate over territories in the Caucasus. The Yuan dynasty clashed with the Chagatai Khanate over trade routes. Former allies became bitter enemies, spending resources on internal conflicts instead of expansion or administration. Local populations began pushing back harder too. The Chinese had never fully accepted Mongol rule, viewing them as foreign barbarians. Rebellions became more frequent and better organized. In Persia, Islamic scholars questioned Mongol laws that conflicted with religious traditions. Russian princes grew bolder in challenging their Mongol overlords. The economic system started cracking under pressure. The Mongols had always relied on tribute and plunder to fund their armies and administration. But you can only squeeze conquered populations so hard before they have nothing left to give. Overtaxed regions became economic wastelands, producing less wealth for the empire. Military technology was changing too. The Mongols' traditional advantages, superior horsemanship, mobility and archery, mattered less against improved castle defenses and new siege weapons. European and Chinese military innovations began catching up to Mongol tactics. Their enemies learned from decades of fighting them. Natural disasters made everything worse. The 1340s brought catastrophic climate changes across Eurasia. Droughts devastated the grasslands that Mongol horses depended on. Famines weakened armies and sparked revolts among hungry populations. The Black Death swept through trade routes the Mongols had created, killing millions and disrupting commerce. Individual Kongs grew more interested in personal luxury than military campaigns. Why risk death on dangerous conquests when you could live comfortably in a palace collecting taxes from subjects? The warrior spirit that built the empire was replaced by administrative bureaucracy. Foreign influence accelerated the decline. Chinese officials increasingly ran the Yuan dynasty's day-to-day operations. Persian nobles gained power in the Ilkhanate. Russian princes collected taxes for the Golden Horde but kept growing portions for themselves. The Mongols became figureheads in their own empire. By the late 1300s, most Mongol territories had either collapsed or been absorbed by local powers. The Ming dynasty expelled the Yuan from China in 1368. The Ilkhanate fragmented into competing Turkish and Persian states. The Golden Horde weakened steadily as Russian principalities grew stronger. Only in their original homeland did Mongol tribes maintain some independence. The speed of collapse was almost as dramatic as their original rise. An empire that took 70 years to build crumbled in roughly the same time frame. But here's what's fascinating. The Mongol collapse wasn't really an ending. It was a transformation that would reshape the entire world in ways nobody expected. The Mongol Empire didn't just vanish into the history books when it crumbled. It left fingerprints all over the world that we're still finding today. Some obvious, some hidden in places you'd never expect. Trade routes that connected east and west. The Mongols didn't invent them, but they perfected them. Before their empire, merchants faced bandits, corrupt officials, and different laws in every territory. The Mongols created the first truly international trade system. One passport, one set of laws, protection guaranteed. This wasn't just about moving silk and spices anymore, it was about moving ideas, technologies, and diseases that would reshape entire continents. Then there's the legal stuff that gets overlooked. The Yasa wasn't just brutal Mongol law, it introduced concepts that modern governments still use. Religious tolerance written into law. That was radical for the 1200s. Most empires forced their beliefs on everyone. The Mongols said worship whoever you want, just pay your taxes and don't rebel. This idea spread like wildfire and influenced legal systems from Russia to China. Military tactics got a complete overhaul too. European knights charging in heavy armor suddenly looked outdated when faced with Mongol mobility and coordination. The composite bow technology spread westward, changing warfare forever. But here's the weird part. The Mongols also spread gunpowder from China to the Islamic world and eventually Europe. They basically handed their enemies the tools that would later be used against them. Cities that got destroyed. Most rebuilt themselves bigger and better. Kiev, Baghdad and countless others rose from the ashes with new architectural styles that blended local traditions with influences from across the empire. The Mongols forced cultural mixing on a scale never seen before. Persian administrators working in China, Chinese engineers building in Persia, Islamic scholars debating with Buddhist monks in Mongolia itself. Language changes were massive but subtle. Mongolian words crept into dozens of languages. Russian still uses Mongol-derived terms for money, customs and government positions. Turkish, Persian and even some European languages picked up Mongolian vocabulary. The word horde comes from the Mongol ordu, meaning camp or palace. Let's not forget the population genetics angle that scientists only recently figured out. Genetic studies suggest that 1 in every 200 men today carries Y chromosome markers linked to the Mongol expansion. That's roughly 16 million direct male descendants of Mongol warriors and leaders scattered across Asia and Europe. Talk about leaving your mark on history. Administrative systems got revolutionized too. The census, postal systems and standardized measurements spread across continents. The Mongols were obsessed with counting everything. People, animals, resources. This bureaucratic efficiency became the foundation for later empires and modern nations. China's administrative structure still shows Mongol influences 8 centuries later. Food culture shifted in unexpected ways. Mongolian dairy techniques spread across Central Asia and into Eastern Europe. Fermented mare's milk might not have caught on globally, but cheese-making methods and preservation techniques did. Horse meat remained popular in Kazakhstan and parts of Central Asia, partly due to Mongol influence. The weird part is how Mongol medicine mixed with local practices everywhere they conquered. Their shamanic healing methods combined with Chinese traditional medicine, Islamic medical knowledge, and European folk remedies. This created hybrid medical traditions that survived long after the empire fell. Religious movements got a boost too. The Mongols protected and transported religious teachers across their empire. Buddhism spread into new regions, Christianity reached deeper into Asia, and Islamic scholarship flourished under Mongol patronage in some areas while being devastated in others. Religious syncretism mixing different faiths became more common in border regions. Then there are the survival skills and cultural practices. Mongolian wrestling techniques influenced martial arts from Turkey to Korea. Their horse training methods spread across the steppes and into sedentary societies. Even their felt-making techniques for yurts influenced textile production in multiple regions. Modern Mongolia still carries obvious traditions, the same livestock herding, similar housing structures, and throat singing that echoes across the steppes. But less obvious influences pop up everywhere. Russian borscht has Mongol influences. Korean fermented foods show steppe connections. Turkish coffee culture has distant Mongol roots. Architecture tells the story too. Mongol rulers commissioned buildings that blended styles from across their empire. The result was architectural fusion that influenced everything from mosque designs to palace layouts. Even today, you can spot these mixed influences in buildings from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia. The psychological impact might be the most lasting legacy. The Mongols proved that nomadic peoples could conquer and rule sedentary civilizations. This shattered assumptions about cultural superiority that had lasted for millennia. Every later nomadic group, from Timur to various Turkic peoples, looked to the Mongol example for inspiration and legitimacy. But what would it actually have been like to wake up as an ordinary person in this empire? That's where the rubber meets the road, and the reality might surprise you more than any legacy ever could. The harsh reality hits you the moment you step off that time machine. Your soft modern hands have never gripped reins in a blizzard. Your feet have never walked miles in leather boots across frozen steppes. Within hours, you'd be begging to go home. Let's start with something basic: staying warm. Mongols wore layers of wool and fur that could handle temperatures dropping to -40 degrees Celsius. Your winter jacket from the mall wouldn't last 5 minutes against those winds. The cold would seep through your clothes, freeze your fingers, and make every breath feel like ice daggers in your lungs. Even if someone gave you proper Mongol clothing, you'd struggle to put it on correctly. One mistake with your boots or hat, and frostbite would claim your toes or ears before sunset. Then there's the riding situation. Mongol children learned to ride before they could properly walk. You probably get sore after an hour on a bicycle. These people spent entire days in the saddle, sometimes covering 100 miles without stopping. Your legs would cramp within the first hour. Your back would scream in agony. The horse would sense your inexperience immediately and probably throw you off into the mud. But wait, there's more fun ahead. Food would become your next nightmare. Forget about your morning coffee or afternoon snacks. Breakfast might be fermented mare's milk that tastes like sour cheese mixed with alcohol. Lunch could be boiled horse meat with chunks of fat floating on top. Dinner, more of the same, assuming the herd survived whatever storm just rolled through. Your modern stomach would reject this diet instantly, leaving you weak and nauseated while everyone else feasted. The social rules would trip you up constantly. Bow wrong to a Khan. Death. Speak when you shouldn't. Punishment. Touch someone's weapons without permission. Big trouble. Walk in front of someone important. Mistake. The Yasa laws controlled every aspect of daily life, and breaking them meant severe consequences. You wouldn't even know which rules you were breaking until guards dragged you away. Physical labor would destroy you completely. Mongols built and collapsed entire yurts in under an hour. You'd still be figuring out which pole goes where when the family finished packing and started moving. Herding animals across dangerous terrain required strength, endurance, and skills developed over decades. Your soft office hands would blister and bleed from handling ropes and tools. Your unused muscles would give out before the first day ended. Weather alone would probably finish you off. Sudden storms could trap you for days in freezing conditions. Drought might force the group to travel for weeks searching for water and grass. Spring floods could wash away everything you owned. Mongols adapted to these challenges because they'd faced them since childhood. You'd panic at the first sign of real danger. And the weird part is, violence lurked everywhere. Raiders attacked without warning. Tribal conflicts erupted over grazing rights or stolen animals. Even within your own group, disputes could turn deadly fast. Mongols settled arguments with swords and arrows, not lawyers and paperwork. One wrong word to the wrong person, and your adventure ends permanently. Let's not forget the complete lack of medical care. Cut yourself badly, hope someone knows basic wound treatment. Break a bone, you might never walk properly again. Catch a disease, pray your body fights it off naturally. Mongols relied on tough immune systems and herbal remedies that worked sometimes. Your modern body, used to antibiotics and hospitals, would struggle against infections that locals shrugged off easily. Sleep would become another challenge. Yurts offered shelter but not comfort. Hard ground, animal smells, smoke from the fire pit, and constant noise from restless livestock. Guards took shifts watching for threats all night. You'd lie awake listening to wolves howling in the distance, wondering what other dangers waited in the darkness. Even simple daily tasks would overwhelm you quickly. Milking goats, tending fires, repairing gear, preparing food, caring for sick animals. Mongols juggled dozens of responsibilities that kept their families alive. You'd fumble through basic chores while others completed complex work efficiently. The psychological pressure might break you fastest of all. Constant danger, brutal living conditions, and zero privacy would wear down your modern mind. Mongols grew up expecting hardship and death as normal parts of life. You grew up expecting comfort and safety as basic rights. Most travelers who visited the Mongol Empire, even experienced ones from harsh medieval societies, struggled to adapt. They had advantages you lack: better physical conditioning, tougher mental attitudes, and familiarity with primitive living. You'd face all the same challenges with none of their preparation. Survival required more than courage or determination. It demanded specific skills, physical toughness, and cultural knowledge that took years to develop. The Mongols weren't just warriors, they were perfectly adapted to one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. But here's what made them truly remarkable. Despite all these crushing challenges,